Chapter 1681. This time, it was his turn to be stunned. He did not speak for a full half a minute. When he came back to his senses, his voice was hoarse. Eat. There was a touch of moisture in her eyes. I can't eat anymore. His gaze was burning. My stomach hurts? She pursed her lips. Anlin, it should be gastroenteritis. She said it calmly, but his gaze became aghast and his face was pale. Why didn't you say so earlier? His voice was so deep that it was about to drip water. He reached out to take the food from her hand and shouted at her, Yi Liangqiu, how stupid are you to drink cold beer and eat this junk food when you're sick? His tone was not good, and his expression was even worse. It could be said that he was fierce, but she felt a little warm. Because he cared about her. He had her in his heart. Yi Liangqiu smiled lightly and said in a relaxed manner, because you want to eat. Although it was relaxed, her forehead was already sweating, and her eyes were full of pain. But she, this fool, was still smiling. Qin Anlin raised his hand, and with a smack, he lightly slapped her face. He really slapped her, but it was a light slap. More than a year ago, after his mother passed away, he also slapped her, and now, he slapped her again. This time, it was because of her. Yi Liangqiu was still smiling, and there was a touch of moisture in her eyes. It was enchanting. Why aren't you leaving? His voice was even lower. Without waiting for her answer, he got up and took her hand, walking outside. Where are we going? She turned her face to look at him. Qin Anlin's voice was a little tense. To the hospital? She was about to say something, but the boss stopped them. You haven't paid yet? Really, he looked like a dog, but he actually wanted to eat and dash. Fortunately, he had good eyesight. Qin Anlin searched for a long time, but he couldn't find any cash. In the end, Yi Liangqiu gave him the money. The boss took it, counted it, and muttered, the handsome guy from last time is still the most straightforward. Miss, you have to choose carefully, especially those stingy cheapskates. You can't marry them. Yi Liangqiu smiled. Thank you, boss. No problem, no problem. The boss went back to work. Qin Anlin looked at Yi Liangqiu and glared at her. Why are you still here? She said, I don't want to go to the hospital. I thought you weren't afraid of pain. However, he grabbed her and dragged her to the road, where he hailed a taxi. Sitting in the back seat, she wanted to say something but hesitated. In the end, she didn't say it directly. Anlin, I don't think we can. He didn't finish his sentence, but he understood. Qin Anlin said magnanimously, I know, I'm not as beastly as you think. Yi Liangqiu pursed her lips and covered her stomach. Actually, don't talk anymore. He opened his coat and carried her in, covering her stomach carefully. His chin rested on her hair, and he murmured, Liangqiu, it's my fault. I shouldn't have brought you to drink cold beer and eat that junk food. But you're always making me angry. His voice was unbelievably gentle, and she felt like she was in a dream. Was this Anlin? She thought that she was dreaming. She reached out and pinched herself. If this was a dream, then she would never wake up from it. How good would that be? Yi Liangqiu lay in his arms. His embrace was warm, and she couldn't bear to leave. Chapter 1682. Looking at how anxious he was because of her, she had never felt so content in her heart before. The emptiness of the past few days seemed to have been filled. She laid there softly, her fingers hooking onto his waist and moving down slowly, touching his chest. His anger was almost ignited by her. Just as he was about to explode, she asked softly, Anlin, if I were to die one day, would you be sad? Before he could say anything, she continued to speak with a light smile, I'm so despicable. You must hate me to the core. He wanted to say something, but her words stopped him. Hence, he said angrily, yes, I hate you to death. She did not speak again. After a while, she smiled faintly, it's what I should do. She hugged him tightly. But I'm still very happy that you're so nice to me now. Qin Anlin's heart was filled with sadness. This sadness surpassed everything else. She had always been despicable. When had she ever been so submissive? Moreover, she looked so sickly. No matter how hard his heart was, it would soften. He reached out and caressed her head. Nonsense. How would I die? He was conflicted. He could not bear to see her, but he hated her and blamed her. These emotions made him feel terrible. They snuggled up to each other in the back seat of the taxi. The taxi driver had been holding it in for a long time. He coughed lightly. Where to? Was the drama Love in Life and Death behind them? The male and female leads were beautiful, but from the rearview mirror, it was obvious that the male lead had fallen for it. Although the female lead had feelings, it was obvious that she was scheming. He had seen too many women say sweet nothings in order to deceive men, and each of them was more brilliant than the other. At this moment, the woman behind them was one of them. No man would be able to resist the temptation of such words of love. They would be willing to give their hearts to her. With his interruption, Yi Liangqiu said calmly, "See City General Hospital." The driver thought to himself that they had already passed C City General Hospital. Now that they were on a one-way street and there was a traffic jam, it would take about an hour to get back. However, these two did not seem to be lacking in money. Even if they were lacking in money, they would not be able to act love in life and death. Let's go in circles. They were playing for romance. Slow down. Therefore, the driver obeyed the order and drove slowly. In any case, he would be paid on time. Qin Anlin didn't notice it. Just as the driver thought, he seemed to have been drugged. After more than an hour, they finally arrived at the hospital. The driver was overjoyed to receive a 1,000 yuan tip. 5 minutes later, Qin Anlin looked at the department in front of him. Gynecology? Didn't she say it was gastroenteritis? Yi Liangqiu smiled. My monthly payment is here. He glared at her. It's a little painful. Give me some medicine. She was still calm. Her eyes were curved as she smiled mischievously. Qin Anlin gritted his teeth and said word by word, "You said your stomach is sick?" I said probably, but I didn't feel well afterward. It should be my monthly payment. She was a little rascal. Qin Anlin looked at the department in front of him. It was dark. Where was the doctor? There's no one? Forget it then. I'll go out and buy some sanitary pads. She said nonchalantly, "It's an old problem anyway." She said it casually, but he did not let her go. With a cold face, he said, "I'll call the doctor over to give you a good checkup." Chapter 1683. The male doctor came over and opened the door. He glanced at Yi Liangqiu. "Come in." Yi Liangqiu looked at Qin Anlin and pursed her lips. "I'm going in." He grabbed her hand and looked at her with a burning gaze. "I'll go in with you." As he spoke, he didn't care about anything else and followed in shamelessly. The male doctor was in his early 30s. He was a rather cold doctor. After working in the gynecology department for a long time, one would develop an apathy. He looked at Yi Liangqiu. "Where are you feeling unwell?" "Period pain," Yi Liangqiu said honestly. "But what I need most now are sanitary pads." The male doctor was married and had been dragged out of his home. His temper wasn't very good, especially when he saw a beauty like Yi Liangqiu. He wasn't very tempted. He raised an eyebrow and glared at Qin Anlin. "Get your husband to buy it." Yi Liangqiu glanced at Qin Anlin. He glared at her. The male doctor was displeased. "What's wrong with buying some sanitary products for my wife?" Yi Liangqiu looked at Qin Anlin. Her eyes were sparkling. He glared at her for a while and then walked out of the door. After a while, he turned around. "Wallet." Yi Liangqiu gave it to him and watched him walk out. She didn't look too happy. After he left, the male doctor said calmly, "You've taken contraceptives before, right? With your constitution, it's better not to take contraceptives, especially morning after pills." Yi Liangqiu didn't deny it. "I know. Why do you still take them if you know?" The doctor said coldly, "Use condoms next time. It's safe and hygienic. You won't get sick easily." Yi Liangqiu secretly wondered if this male doctor wasn't being sarcastic. However, this person was quite principled. He didn't check it until Qin Anlin came back and Yi Liangqiu cleaned herself up. He repeated what he said to Qin Anlin. Qin Anlin's attitude was much better. "I'll be careful." The male doctor meowed him, but didn't say anything in the end. He waved his hand to chase them away. It was almost midnight when he walked out of the hospital. The air was thin and terrifyingly cold. Standing on the deserted street, Yi Liangqiu couldn't get a cab even after trying for a long time. She was so cold that she was shivering. "Ask the driver to drive over." She picked up the phone and was about to make the call, but he stopped her. He reached out to hold her hand and put the phone in his pocket. Then he took off his coat and draped it over her shoulders. He buttoned her up button by button, until he reached the top one. His eyes were intent as he did all this. Yi Liangqiu breathed softly and looked at him. "All right," he exhaled. "Let's go." As he spoke, he held her hand and walked along the deserted street. The moonlight shone on his side profile, making him look even more handsome and alluring. His palm was warm and strong. She was reluctant but worried. "Anlin, you're the one who's sick." He continued to walk forward. "If you were worried about me, you wouldn't have said that your stomach hurt?" With that said, he turned his head sideways and glanced at her. His gaze was as though he was looking at an ignorant child. Yi Liangqiu felt that she was in the wrong, so she followed beside him. After a while, she said softly, "I'll return your coat." She wanted to take it off, but her hand was held down by him. Then he placed his hand in the coat's pocket and said in a deep voice, "If you want to make trouble as much as you can." His tone was a little stern and he glanced at her. Chapter 1684. Later, she leaned on his shoulder and wrapped her arms around his waist. Just like countless old couples, they leaned on each other. Anlin, if only we could keep going like this. How wonderful would that be? Even if I had so many expectations in my heart, even if I thought we could walk to the end, would it still be this simple, peaceful, and wonderful? She was a little scared and buried her face in his shoulder. They walked deep into the street. After walking for about 2 hours, they stood in front of the Su mansion. He sent her home but didn't take her back. Standing face to face, he gathered her coat and smiled. Liangqiu, this is as far as I can go. His words had a deeper meaning. She wasn't stupid, so there was no way she couldn't tell. Tomorrow is a new day. He hugged her and whispered in her ear, I like you and admire you. You are the best lover and the best opponent. In the past, he had always underestimated her. He underestimated her ability and how cruel she could be. He was a little curious and puzzled. What kind of emotions did she have to be reluctant to part with him and then attack King Entertainment at the same time? She thought he didn't know what she had done to Xia Mian. He knew everything, including the fact that Che Taixian had slept with Xia Mian. He just felt it was a pity. Xia Mian could have had some success, if only she hadn't been so ambitious. But she had been easily killed by Yi Liangqiu? Xia Mian's incident was a trigger. And he was waiting for her to detonate it. He looked at her with a burning gaze. Liangqiu, take care. He lifted his chin slightly, motioning for her to enter. At this moment, their parting had crushed her. She wanted to throw herself into his arms and tell him that she couldn't hold on any longer. She didn't want to go against him. The ATV wasn't important to her. He was the most important thing to her. Her lips trembled slightly. After a long time, she looked down and said, Anlin, can we not go? Qin Anlin looked up at the luxurious mansion in front of him. This was the place where they used to play together when they were young. But now, this house was his hatred. Liangqiu, you should understand that I will never be able to go in. He reached out and rubbed her hair, giving her the last tenderness. Go in. Silently waiting for you. She looked at him and suddenly felt pain in her breathing. She couldn't bear to part with him. When he turned around, he wanted to leave, but she hugged him from behind. Anlin, are these 2 days not important to you? She leaned against his back and rubbed her face against his back as she whispered. His body froze as he looked down at her hand. After staring at it for a long time, he smiled bitterly and said, Liangqiu, I can't figure out which is the real you and which is the fake you. Can you still tell the difference? She slowly loosened her grip. After a long time, she took a step back and took a deep breath of the night air. The pain in her heart pierced deep into the depths of her soul. He said that she was acting. So, Qin Anlin, are you just playing along with my act? You said that you don't know which is real and which is fake because you don't want to believe me anymore. Yes. She smiled lightly. Qin Anlin, I was greedy. You're everything I wanted, but I forgot that I can't have you since a long time ago. She walked up to him and unbuttoned his coat one by one. Her fingers fondled the fabric of the coat longingly. Finally, she made up her mind and placed it in his hand. Be careful when you go back. Chapter 1685. He looked at her, at the coat in his hands, and said calmly, You can wear it. Yi Liangqiu shook her head. No need. She stuffed it into his hands and turned to leave. She walked very quickly, but her arm was caught by him again. When she turned back, her long hair danced beautifully in the night sky. Her fair face was stunningly beautiful. He looked at her for a long time before saying softly, I'll pick you up from King Entertainment. Actually, it would be tomorrow. She was in a daze for a moment before realizing that she had been too busy and had forgotten. After a while, she nodded. I'll get off work at 5 tomorrow. He didn't put on his coat. Instead, he put it on his arm and turned to walk down the street. She stood on the spot and watched for a long time. Her feet were sore, and she couldn't see him anymore. The black carved door beside him slowly moved open, emitting an ear-piercing, heavy sound. Yi Liangqiu turned around slowly and saw Su Shiqing in front of the main residence. Why was he here? She adjusted her clothes and walked in. The harsh sound came from behind her again. So late. Su Shiqing coughed lightly. Looks like your relationship with Anlin has warmed up quite well. Yi Liangqiu walked inside. When she passed by Su Shiqing, she smiled coldly. As long as that day is not erased, he will never treat me the same as before. Just like how I treat him, he won't hold back when it's necessary. Yi Liangqiu's face was covered in a cold expression as he said, So, don't hold any hopes of getting lucky. Then stay away from him, Su Shiqing said emotionlessly. Yi Liangqiu smiled and ignored him as she walked into the main hall. It was late at night and Silent had already fallen asleep. She knew that Su Shiqing wouldn't leave easily once he came, so she was prepared to deal with him. She sat down on the sofa slowly and ordered the servants to make a cup of tea to warm her stomach. Her stomach was starting to hurt from the wind outside, but she endured it so that Su Shiqing wouldn't notice. Su Shicheng leaned on his walking stick and clasped his hands together, looking at her with a burning gaze. Because of his skinniness, his eyes were deeply sunken. In the middle of the night, he looked a little scary. Yi Liangqiu's tone was indifferent. It's up to me whether to leave or not. Su Shicheng was about to lose his temper when she looked at him faintly. You said he was my prize? This time, Su Shicheng's complexion improved a lot. He coldly smiled. Yes, Qin family's people can only be prizes. He thought about it, but he was still worried, so he continued, you have to know what's important. A servant brought the tea over. Yi Liangqiu took 2 sips and smiled faintly. Of course. She looked at him and suddenly asked, is Qin Pei okay? Su Shicheng's expression became extremely unnatural. As usual. Don't worry, I won't kill him and break my promise to you. As long as you put King Entertainment's income under ATV, I will let him go. Let him go? Yi Liangqiu really didn't know if Su Shicheng was insulting his intelligence or hers. At that time, the first thing he would do would be to kill Qin Pei and cause the fact that she and Qin Anlin would never be able to return. She knew exactly what he was thinking in his heart. Chapter 1686. Yi Liangqiu smiled. Dad managed it well in the past. Her sudden friendliness surprised Su Shicheng a little, but then he sighed slightly. Liangqiu, no matter how unhappy we are still father and daughter. We are blood relatives in this world, and others can't compare to us. When he said this, his heart was also filled with emotion. He was already in his twilight years, and his daughter was at the peak of her career. Although she was a woman, a celebrity, from his observations these past few days, he could tell that she was very capable. She was strong enough to contend against Qin Anlin. Perhaps even when he was in his prime, she wouldn't be inferior to him. Because she was ruthless enough. Perhaps his worries were unnecessary. Yi Liangqiu just smiled and didn't say much. Su Shicheng's heart, however, was a little anxious. He didn't have much time left in his life, and he wanted to see ATV unify the industry as soon as possible. Dad is old, and my only hope is you. His voice was old, and he unconsciously showed weakness. Yi Liangqiu finally raised her eyes and looked at him with a burning gaze. Dad, I won't let you down. She was polite and respectful, and Su Shicheng's heart was quite comforted. After the sublimation of their relationship, they chatted. It's New Year's in a few days. How are you going to spend it with Momo? Before Yi Liangqiu said anything, Su Shicheng's eyes showed a touch of desire. How about I take you to Hokkaido to go skiing? Yi Liangqiu pursed her lips and smiled. Anlin said he wanted the children to celebrate the New Year together. She lied without changing her expression. Because she really didn't want to be with Su Shicheng on a day like New Year's, it would only make her feel disgusted and full of hatred. She didn't want to see him, let alone celebrate the New Year together. Su Shicheng's eyes flashed with a touch of disappointment, and his old face was stiff, but after a while, he recovered and forced a smile. I see. That's good, the children have to celebrate the New Year together, and it's good for Qin Anlin to let down his guard. Yi Liangqiu didn't say anything else. She swiped her phone a few times as if she was reading the news. Su Shicheng's mouth was dry, and he didn't drink any water for a long time. His heart was a little stifled, and he felt a little wronged. This was his home. At this moment, a silent cry came from upstairs, as if someone had woken up from a dream. Yi Liangqiu immediately got up, but then she sat back down, clutching her stomach. Sit down, I'll go take a look. Su Shicheng's heart was in his throat. He truly loved silence. Thus, he went upstairs with his walking stick and dismissed his bodyguard. Xing, wait for me downstairs. Get the driver to be on standby. I'll leave after Silent falls asleep. His tone was still a little aggrieved. If he didn't leave, he would be hated. When she reached upstairs, Silent was indeed awake. He was crying hard, and the nanny was trying her best to coax him, but it was useless. Su Shicheng immediately went up and obediently coaxed Silent. Very soon, Silent stopped crying and giggled. She hugged Su Shicheng with her little arms and refused to let go. Su Shicheng's withered old soul bloomed like a flower. He kissed the little guy, and his expression changed. Our Silent is still the best. She's not like your mother, cold and lifeless. It's not good for Grandpa. Actually, how could he not know that Liangqiu that child resented him and hated him? Downstairs, Yi Liangqiu drank her tea slowly and didn't say anything for a long time. Chapter 1687. Yi Liangqiu glanced at him and smiled. Xing, how long have you been following Mr. Su? Xing was a stocky man and he was not even 30 years old. When he heard this, his square face turned red. After a while, he squeezed out a sentence. Missy, I have been following Mr. Su for 5 years. Is Mr. Su nice to you? Yi Liangqiu smiled and lowered her head to drink her tea. Then, she looked up at Xing. Ah Xing was a rough man. He had never been so close to Missy, who was like a fairy. Moreover, Missy used to be a superstar, the Empress. In his heart, he had always admired her. He did not expect that one day, Missy would talk to him. Ah Xing's heart was about to float. However, he did not dare to act rashly on his face. He said honestly, "Not bad. I bought a house in B City and my mother came over from the countryside." Yi Liangqiu knew what was going on. She asked casually, "Do you have anyone in mind?" This time, it was as if she had stepped on Ah Xing's tail or rubbed his heart. It was painful, numb and itchy. Fang Zheng's face turned red. He could not squeeze out a sentence for a long time. Yi Liangqiu stood up and patted his back. She smiled, "Don't be bored." This time, Ah Xing was really suffocating. He could only breathe in but not out. His face turned even redder, as if it was congested with blood. His breathing was hot. His gaze was burning as he looked at Missy, who was like a fairy. Yi Liangqiu smiled and sat back down. Ah Xing lost his composure. He only regained his senses after 2 minutes. He said softly, "Not yet." As he said this, he stole a glance at Missy, who was like a fairy. Yi Liangqiu smiled, "If there is someone suitable, I will help you keep an eye out." Ah Xing's face turned red again. He thanked her softly and kept quiet. In his heart, he secretly thought that it would be great if he could have someone like the eldest miss who looked like a fairy. However, he could only think about it. For someone like the eldest miss to look at him, it was enough to make him completely satisfied. At this moment, Su Shicheng walked down the stairs slowly. He looked at Ah Xing's flushed face and said in a low voice, "What happened? Ah Xing, did you make eldest miss unhappy?" Ah Xing said that he dared not. Yi Liangqiu stood up and took a glance at Ah Xing. Then, she smiled and said to Su Shicheng, "I was talking about introducing a girlfriend to Ah Xing. Ah Xing seems to be shy." Su Shicheng glanced sideways and looked at Ah Xing. Then, he smiled and said, "I see. It's time for him to find a wife. Otherwise, he's almost 30? But if he has a wife, his legs can't be weak." Ah Xing was also a pure and crude man. How could he listen to all these? His face turned red again and he was speechless for a long time. "Dad, stop teasing him." Yi Liangqiu smiled. "Let me send you out." Su Shicheng's mood became better. He turned around and said, "You don't have to send me out. Your body is weak. You will be fine with Ah Xing around." Ah Xing immediately expressed that he would take care and protect Mr. Su. Yi Liangqiu nodded and sent them to the door. She patted Ah Xing's arm and said, "Thank you for your hard work." Ah Xing suddenly felt that he was floating. He didn't know how to speak and he didn't say anything for a long time. Su Shicheng and Ah Xing sat in the car together. After driving for a while, Ah Xing was driving in front. He suddenly said, "Mister, actually the eldest miss is very concerned about you." Chapter 1688. Su Shicheng was no longer the same as before. Even if a bodyguard were to speak to him, he would feel that it was a form of solitude. However, Ah Xing was not a talkative person in the past. Why was he behaving like this today? Su Shicheng's eyes were old but sharp. "Why did you say good things about her?" Ah Xing was driving and his forehead was covered in sweat. He stole a glance at the rearview mirror and said hurriedly, "Elder Miss is a nice person." Su Shicheng closed his eyes again. Liangqiu is not mean to her servants. Ah Xing relaxed his body and he was extremely nervous. He had such thoughts about Elder Miss and he did not dare to let Mr. Su find out about it. Otherwise, he would not be able to live. He asked discreetly, "Sir, what's going on between Miss Qin and Mr. Qin?" Although Ah Xing was following Su Shicheng, he was innocent. He did not know about Su Shicheng's dark side. Just as he finished his question, Su Shicheng's gaze suddenly turned dangerous. "Ah Xing, there are some things that you shouldn't ask about. I like that you are steady and quiet. That's why I kept you by my side. Don't let me down." Ah Xing did not dare to speak anymore and focused on driving. However, Yi Liangqiu's face kept flashing in his mind. After that, he followed Su Shicheng back and laid down in his single room. Whenever he closed his eyes, he would think of Elder Miss who was like a fairy. Then, that night, Ah Xing's dream passed out. When he woke up, he was in a sorry state. He was panting heavily and his hair was drenched in sweat. The darkness covered his sorry state. However, it also felt like there was an invisible hand that could reach out from the dark and choke his lifeline. He felt that his breathing was not smooth. Whenever he thought of Elder Miss, his body would hurt again. Ah Xing was still a virgin and had never done anything between a man and a woman. Once that happened, it was out of control. He lowered his head and looked for a long time. Finally, he went to the bathroom and turned on the water. Based on his instinct, he did something bad for the first time. His mind was filled with Elder Miss who was like a fairy. In the end, he only muttered Elder Miss's name. After everything was over, there was only emptiness. The water was cold, and the air was cold. Ah Xing's body leaned against the wall and slid down slowly. In the end, he used his hands to cover his face and rubbed it vigorously. Late at night, at the Su mansion, Yi Liangqiu held a glass of wine in her hand and swirled it gently. It had been more than a year, and she hadn't been able to find Qin Pei. If she found Qin Pei, she would immediately kill Su Shicheng. Those sins vanished into thin air. She had never thought of letting Anlin know about those things. However, she had not been able to find a breakthrough until today, when she saw Ah Xing sneaking a glance at her. She admitted that she was despicable. She made use of Ah Xing, or she would make use of him in the future. She made use of his lust or his admiration for her. Perhaps, if Ah Xing worked for her, he would eventually die, but she would still do it. Perhaps, she had Su Shicheng's blood in her. She was the same as him, equally unscrupulous. Just now, Silent cried because she asked the nanny to do it. Su Shicheng loved Silent, so he went up and gave her the chance to tease Ah Xing. She slowly took a sip of the red wine, and a glint flashed across her long and beautiful eyes. Chapter 1689. Every year, King Entertainment's end-of-year party was extremely grand. It was held in GM's largest ballroom. When Yi Liangqiu arrived, Keim picked her up in the car. He said that Qin Anlin couldn't get away, but he had sent his trusted aide. This was enough to show how much he valued her. However, Yi Liangqiu soon realized that this was just wishful thinking on her part. If everything that had happened before was all about her scheming against Qin Anlin, then from now on, it was Qin Anlin's counterattack. Or rather, this finale was an elaborate scheme he had set up for her. At least, Yi Liangqiu stood on the red carpet and looked at Qin Anlin and Xia Mian standing side by side in the distance, like a golden couple. She smiled bitterly. Only then did she understand what he had said last night. He had really declared war on her, and she was still trapped in his gentleness. She was too naive. Xia Mian was wearing a light purple striped skirt tonight, revealing her deep cleavage. She was fair and looked like she was made of money. She wore a very expensive diamond necklace around her neck. Xia Mian couldn't afford it herself, so the only possibility was Qin Anlin. Her eyes fell on Qin Anlin's face. She smiled faintly, and there was a hint of mockery in her smile. Then, she reached out and grabbed Keim. Keim was startled. He leaned against Yi Liangqiu and smiled bitterly, posing for the reporters to take pictures. His back was cold. He could already feel President Qin's gaze stabbing at him like two knives. He smiled bitterly and said in a low voice, "Mr. Yi, it's about time. I'm afraid I won't live to see the sun tomorrow." After a pause, he said, "I'm still alive to wait for my child's mother." Yi Liangqiu smiled and said in a low voice, "Then we'll cooperate. Don't worry, you won't die. At most, you'll have your hands and feet broken." In fact, they all knew how much Qin Anlin cared about her. However, the person he wanted to deal with wasn't her, but ATV. Tonight, he was obviously trying to embarrass her and the ATV. What he was doing was giving him a taste of his own medicine. When Yi Liangqiu was almost done with the photos, she walked in the direction of Qin Anlin. In the fierce evening wind, she felt like she had walked for a century on that 10-meter-long carpet. "Anlin, you're here. But even though I'm getting closer, I feel like I'm getting further and further away." Finally, she walked to his side and linked her arm with Keim's. Keim felt so innocent. He put on a bitter face and didn't dare to look at Qin Anlin's face. Qin Anlin and Xia Mian stood side by side as if they were being interviewed. However, Yi Liangqiu knew that he was waiting for her to come over so that he could give her a fatal blow. She smiled. "It seems that I'm not President Qin's dance partner tonight." Qin Anlin looked away from the reporters and directly at Yi Liangqiu's arm, which was holding Keim's arm. His gaze was so intense that it could burn a hole through Keim's arm. Keim coughed lightly and tried to retract his arm, but he didn't. Qin Anlin's gaze finally shifted to Yi Liangqiu's face. He smiled faintly. "Yes, Xia Mian, as a rising star of King Entertainment, will be my dance partner tonight." Yi Liangqiu nodded and still had a smile on her face. "President Qin is quite creative." She looked at Keim, who immediately waved her hand. "Mr. Yi, I'm very busy tonight. I might not have time to be your dance partner." "I see." She looked at Qin Anlin and smiled. "Then I'll call Ran over. He hasn't left yet." Chapter 1690. Yes. She smiled relaxedly. "But President Qin forgot that if it weren't for our personal relationship, I wouldn't have had to attend the party, and I wouldn't have been insulted by President Qin for no reason." She looked straight at him. "President Qin, don't forget that our honor and disgrace are one. Too many scandals won't do you any good." He pondered for a moment. "For example, Che Taixian CD?" His voice was a little low, and Yi Liangqiu's eyes turned cold. So he knew. Xia Mian's blood froze. Che Taixian? What was the relationship between Yi Liangqiu and Che Taixian? Could it be that sleeping with her was a conspiracy? And the mastermind was Yi Liangqiu? Xia Mian's face turned pale, and she stared straight at Yi Liangqiu. Yi Liangqiu quickly recovered from the shock. She looked at Xia Mian and smiled. Miss Xia, didn't you pay attention to your facial expression? It won't look good if the reporters take photos of you like this. Xia Mian was stunned for a moment, and then she immediately put on a sweet expression, but her eyes still looked as if she wanted to eat Yi Liangqiu up. Qin Anlin stretched out his hand. Let's go. His arm was in front of them, and there were two women in front of them. Yi Liangqiu wouldn't think that he was talking to her, but it was ridiculous to say it to Xia Mian. Wasn't he tired of playing such a clumsy trick all the time? Xia Mian also hesitated for a moment, and then she carefully put her hand in Qin Anlin's arm. He didn't object? Her heart slowly rose with a touch of joy. He didn't break free, which meant that his female companion was really her, not Yi Liangqiu. No matter what the reason was, the person standing in front of President Qin was her. Xia Mian couldn't believe it, and she was overconfident. Then she showed a victorious smile to Yi Liangqiu. There was a hint of provocation in her eyes, so what if Yi Liangqiu was Mrs. Qin? President Qin had just slapped her in the face. The centennial scene was captured by the reporters. Compared to Xia Mian's complacency, Yi Liangqiu stood aside, looking a bit depressed. In her heart, she knew that Qin Anlin would not just show off for no reason. He must have something more important to announce to the reporters. If there was no mistake, it was to formally announce the plan to acquire ATV. She pursed her lips tightly. Her fingers were clenched into fists, and her insides were already dripping with sweat. Sure enough, Qin Anlin faced the media and smiled calmly, his tone calm. Thank you, everyone, for coming. I also thank ATV's chairman Yi for coming to King Entertainment's Tail Teeth. However, I still regret to announce that King Entertainment will carry out a comprehensive acquisition plan for ATV after the new year. The entertainment reporters were in an uproar. A few days ago, President Qin was still showing off his love in a high-profile manner. Now, he was holding Xia Mian's hand, openly declaring war against his own wife. So their love from before was all fake? The entertainment reporters weren't too interested in the business world. They were more interested in President Qin's true feelings. Did he really have an affair with a second-tier actress, and then abandon the Queen Yi Liangqiu? As they frantically asked questions, Qin Anlin only smiled and didn't answer. This was where his brilliance came from. This scene was embarrassing enough for Yi Liangqiu. At this moment, she realized that when necessary, he could be ruthless. Kaim, who was standing to the side, secretly broke out in a cold sweat. Mr. Ye's expression was really ugly. And President Qin, if she went too far, what if Mr. Yi took things too hard and really made him a cuckold? It would be too late for regrets. Yi Liangqiu took a deep breath and said in a very low voice, Kaim, catch me when I fall to the ground later. Chapter 1691. Kaim froze, but his instinct told him to catch Yi Liangqiu in time. However, he only managed to catch her before Qin Anlin carried her away. Liangqiu. President Qin, who was originally holding Xia Mian in his arms, looked at his wife anxiously. The momentum of wanting to buy ATV disappeared in an instant. Yi Liangqiu's face was pale, and her lips were almost colorless. On the light-colored evening gown she was wearing, a bright red stain was glaring under the lights. Ah, could it be a miscarriage? A female reporter covered her mouth and screamed with red eyes. How pitiful. She was humiliated on the red carpet by her own husband and a small-time artist under her company. How pitiful. The reporters all aimed their cameras at Yi Liangqiu's blood-stained gown and believed the female reporter's words. Women knew this the best. Mr. Yi was pregnant, and it was highly possible that she had a miscarriage due to the sudden shock. In fact, even if it was impossible, the reporters still hoped that it was possible. After all, the more gossip there was, the more money they could make. Qin Anlin held Yi Liangqiu in his arms. His face was livid and pale, and it was even worse than the fainted Yi Liangqiu. Miscarriage? Of course, he knew it was impossible, because she was on her period. However, he naturally wouldn't explain such a private matter to others. So, he picked her up and walked towards the limousine at the entrance. In his heart, there was a touch of panic and fear. Xia Mian stood there, still in a daze. She murmured, how could she be pregnant? It's impossible. She opened her eyes, and the glaring lights shone on her face. It was as if she was standing on an empty stage, and the malicious and mocking gazes were all aimed at her. She stood there like a clown. She was all alone. At this moment, she felt like she had been beaten back to her original state. Those lights were very hot. Her face was hot, and it was extremely uncomfortable. Her entire body seemed to be bound by something, and even breathing was painful. She screamed at those who mocked her and looked down on her. She didn't have a miscarriage at all. She didn't, she faked it. She's despicable. The surroundings immediately quietened down. It was so quiet that even the sound of a pin dropping could be heard clearly. All eyes fell on Xia Mian again, and they were filled with disdain. Xia Mian had walked the path of a pure and innocent girl, but now, her image had been completely destroyed. No matter how one looked at her, she was just a scheming bitch who destroyed other people's families. Xia Lu's red lips opened slightly, looking at the camera silently. She suddenly covered her face, so dazzling, so dazzling. She lost. She was utterly defeated. She thought that she had won, but Yi Liangqiu turned the tables with a little trick. She suddenly turned around, and her light blue dress looked particularly cold in the night wind. Her eyes were bloodshot, and she looked at the direction in which Qin Anlin had gone. He didn't have a trace of nostalgia, never. She was being wishful thinking. Qin Anlin carried Yi Liangqiu directly into the car, and Keim had already come back to his senses. Although he knew that Mr. Yi was acting, he still had to put on a good show, right? Keim started the car and asked calmly, "President Qin, which hospital are we going to?" "Sheng Yuan." Qin Anlin's voice was a little hoarse. Chapter 1692. The car drove steadily. Qin Anlin held Yi Liangqiu in one arm and took out his phone with the other. Yi Liangqiu buried her face in his chest. Through the fabric of his shirt, she could feel his heartbeat. It was beating really, really fast. Her fingers slowly tightened around him, bit by bit. She opened her eyes and closed them slightly. She sighed. "Anlin, I don't want to go to the hospital." "You're awake?" His voice was still hoarse. He held her with one arm and answered the call with the other. He hung up after saying a few words to the person on the other end. She buried her face in her waist and said in a very small voice, "Anlin, I didn't have a miscarriage." "I know." He raised his head slightly and tightened his jaw. "After we go to the hospital, I won't care about you anymore." As he said this, he seemed to be explaining and trying to convince her, but more like he was trying to convince himself. "After all, this time, it was also because of me." As soon as he said this, both of them felt their hearts tremble. They both remembered the crazy things they had done in the past few nights. She had menstrual pain and fainted from the pain. More or less, it had something to do with his lack of self-control. She didn't say anything else. She just tightened her fingers around his waist. Keim glanced at his boss in disdain. What a useless boss. Where was his previous coldness? He was taken down in a few moves. Poor Xia Mian. She finally had a good dream, but she woke up so soon. However, Mr. Ye's miscarriage would probably put President Qin in a very passive position. Chen Shimi's hat was firmly on him. Besides, President Qin's heart was easily softened, but Mr. Ye's heart was ruthlessly hard. As Keim was thinking about this, the car had already arrived at Xingyuan Hospital. At the entrance of the hospital, paparazzi were already waiting there. They immediately took photos of Yi Liangqiu being admitted to the hospital. Coupled with the late-night arrival of the famous obstetrician and gynecologist, Dr. May, further confirmed that it was a miscarriage. Qin Anlin couldn't care less at this time. He carried her to the examination room. Dr. May examined her and looked a little serious. Her blood flow is not smooth. She didn't take care of herself during the confinement period. Plus, she didn't pay attention to keeping warm during her period. That's why she suddenly fainted. Qin Anlin looked down at Yi Liangqiu with an unfriendly expression. However, she flew over with a sentence, "You should go to the tail teeth. Keim has already gone back for me." His voice was heavy. "You're only worried about this now?" Yi Liangqiu nodded very sincerely. Looking at him, he smiled faintly. "Yes. However, the one who should be worried is you, President Qin." He was extremely displeased by the word CEO Qin and glared at her for a long time. Dr. May, who was watching from the side, felt both angry and amused at the same time. They were both big bosses and close married couples, but when they quarreled, they were still as shameless as children. "I'll go get the medicine. You two, keep arguing." Dr. May shook her head and smiled. "As long as you don't call me out in the middle of the night again, I'll be happy." She then walked out. Just then, a young nurse on duty came in and brought a set of clothes. "President Qin, this is what you asked for." Just then, a young nurse on duty came in and brought a set of clothes. "President Qin, this is what you asked for." Qin Anlin reached out to take it. He nodded and closed the door. At that moment, she was still wearing an elegant evening gown. He couldn't take his eyes off her the first time he saw her tonight. Chapter 1693. However, he forced himself to look away. He told himself not to be soft-hearted towards her. But in the end, his heart still soft-hearted. He took the clothes over and said faintly, "Change your clothes?" She lowered her head and buried her face in her arms. "Yi Liangqiu." He raised his voice slightly, but she still didn't respond. Finally, he pushed aside her long hair and realized that she had fallen asleep. Qin Anlin narrowed his eyes, and his expression didn't look good. How could she still fall asleep in such a situation? He patted her face, but she reached out and hugged his arm. She hugged him shamelessly like a little koala bear. She buried her face in his arm and murmured, "Anlan, I'm very sleepy, so tired." His body trembled, and he looked at her with a burning gaze. She was rarely vulnerable, but her vulnerability was usually because she had something to ask for. He reached out and caressed her slightly opened lips, and his voice was already hoarse. "Yi Liangqiu, I can't believe you anymore." Just like today, when he carried her into the car, he suspected that it was just a trick, but he still carried her into the car without hesitation. Because even if there was a 1% chance that she would faint, he didn't dare to take the risk. "But Liangqiu, it's just wishful thinking on my part, isn't it? Everything you say to me, everything you do, is just an act. It's just a small trick to compete with me, isn't it?" She didn't answer him because she was really tired to the point of falling asleep. Her breathing was long, and her body was soft. He bent down and looked at her closely. Although she had makeup on, there was still a faint green under her eyes, and he could tell that she was overworked. Qin Anlin hesitated for a moment, and he reached out to cover her back. Her skin had always been good, and it was as smooth as cream. He reached out to pull it down for her, and the smooth fabric slid down to her waist. It was like a peeled flower bud, and the inside was soft and tender. His gaze seemed to be on fire, and he stared for a long time. Finally, he removed everything and gently put on the thick clothes for her. He put them on one piece at a time, and he even put on a thick tampon. But after a while, he suddenly remembered that she was wearing a gown and he couldn't find a tampon. So she used tampons? Because of this thought, his handsome face slightly blazed up, and his face was also a little hot. After careful consideration, he still personally went to verify it. Indeed, she had used a tampon. Would it be comfortable inside? Was it comfortable with him inside? He snorted softly and helped her take it off. At this moment, she finally woke up. She opened her eyes and looked at him. Her voice was a little fuzzy. "Anlin? Don't use this anymore. It's not safe or hygienic," he said gruffly. Then, she saw the thing in his hand and blushed. "Why did you?" Embarrassed and angry, she simply didn't know what to say. Qin Anlin went to wash it off. When he turned around, she had already adjusted her clothes. She sat up and buried her face in her coat. "Are you shy?" His voice was cold. "How can you not be sick when you're on your period?" After saying that, he picked up the thin t-shirt and looked at her coldly. Yi Liangqiu snatched it from him and stuffed it into the bag together with the gown. "You were the one who deliberately humiliated me by making me attend the party, and in the end," she sneered. "President Qin, did I forget to congratulate you?" He looked at her. "What do you think?" Chapter 1694. Qin Anlin looked at her pale face and suddenly realized something. "You fainted. You faked it." She didn't deny it. Instead, she said lightly, "Am I supposed to sit still and wait for President Qin's attack?" "So, you pretended to faint?" He narrowed his eyes. Although he had guessed it, he was still a little angry. Yi Liangqiu chuckled. "What else could I do?" Qin Anlin stared at her for a while and then asked slowly, "I'm just curious. What's the matter with the blood on your dress? Don't tell me it's bleeding from inside?" There was no blood on her underwear, so the blood on her dress was really suspicious. Yi Liangqiu raised her hand. Her nails were a little long. She opened her red lips and said, "A little blood." Qin Anlin narrowed his eyes. He couldn't believe his ears. She was really something. "President Qin reminded me to be careful. So, I thought it might not be a bad thing to plan for rain." She was still indifferent. This time, Qin Anlin didn't get angry. Instead, he smiled. "Yi Liangqiu, I underestimated you." She smiled. "I'm afraid Xia Mian's character is going to be ruined." Her smile was a little hateful. "I'm very curious. Why did you drag Xia Mian down with you? Is it because you knew she would die sooner or later, so you used her as a cannon fodder?" Qin Anlin looked a little gloomy. "It has nothing to do with Mr. Yi." She smiled gently. Suddenly, she stood up and hugged him. She buried her face in his neck. "Anlin, don't use others to anger me. I won't do that, okay? They would compete, but not others. Otherwise, she wouldn't be able to stand it." Her voice was calm and didn't have many ups and downs. There was only a little jealousy in it. But in his ears, it was like a stormy sea. So, your heart can also hurt. His hand gripped her shoulder and firmly pushed her away. His gaze was cold. Yi Liangqiu, you should bear all of this. She stubbornly tried to hug him, but he pushed her away. Her hand was raised in midair, and she felt a little helpless. For the sake of the child, I won't go too far, but Yi Liangqiu, if you dare, I promise you'll regret it. He leaned close to her and said in a low and hoarse voice, you should know my bottom line. She understood that what she was about to do now was to challenge his bottom line. She smiled at him and stepped back. So he knew her decision and backed away. In the middle of the night, they looked at each other in the cold hospital. After a long time, he said, I'll ask the driver to pick you up. She didn't move. Instead, she calmly replied, there's no need for that. A person who has a miscarriage should stay in the hospital for a few days, right? He was furious. Yi Liangqiu. Too much, aren't I? She smiled, but there wasn't a trace of a smile in her eyes. Go and clarify the relationship between you and Xia Mian. I'll say, you're not pregnant. He glared at her, but she was fearless. Qin Anlin had never seen such a shameless woman. But this woman was his wife, the woman he loved and hated. He couldn't do anything to her. His overwhelming hatred was always dispelled by her shamelessly. Every time he hardened his heart, he couldn't help but soften in front of her. And this despicable woman seemed to be determined to get him. Chapter 1695. Qin Anlin glared at her. She didn't avoid his gaze at all. She stared back at him hatefully. After a long time, he lightly laughed, and his fingers lightly caressed her red lips. His voice was hoarse as he said, Yi Liangqiu, very good. I won't clarify. He looked at her mockingly. Then you can just announce the miscarriage. He turned around and was about to leave when she called out to him anxiously. Qin Anlin. He didn't turn around, he just stopped, and his cold and clear voice sounded out. Yi Liangqiu, think it over before you make a decision. There was a hint of threat in his tone. How could she not understand? She glared at him. For a long time, she didn't say anything. As for him, he opened the door gently and paused for a moment. He turned around and looked at her quietly. Liangqiu, take good care of yourself. She felt as though the blood in her body had frozen and her throat was blocked by something. She couldn't speak for a long time. He was really angry. However, she wouldn't admit it wrongly. She didn't do anything wrong, nor did she have a choice. This day would come. A few days ago, she just couldn't bear to part with him. It was just that, they couldn't bear to. Her lips moved, but his gaze was slightly tense. Neither of them spoke. After a long time, he finally turned around and closed the door gently. In the middle of the night, that slight sound finally broke through her defenses. All her pretense and strength were broken. She was so fragile and needed him so much. So, when someone else appeared beside him, her heart would hurt so much. She rushed out without even wearing her shoes. The hospital corridor was so cold that there wasn't a single trace of human life. Her feet felt as though she was stepping on ice blades. However, she couldn't care less. Right now, she just wanted to find him. She just wanted to be with him. She just wanted to feel his warmth. Even if it was cold, she wanted it. Even if he wanted to push her away and hate her, at this moment, she wanted to hug him. The elevator was on the same floor. She pressed the button but there was no one inside. Where did he go? She was flustered and turned around. She leaned against the wall of the elevator and gasped for air in the cold. Her eyes, searching everywhere, looking for him. At the end of the dark corridor, a small window shone with a trace of light. Yi Liangqiu pursed her lips tightly. She felt that they were dry, so she licked them. Her hand gripped tightly as she stared at him in the dark. He stood there smoking and did not go away. Why didn't you leave? Her voice trembled, hoarse. His slender fingers held the cigarette, and the red sparks rose and fell with his movements. He just stood there, gazing at her deeply, and did not answer. Finally, she walked over, step by step. It was very difficult. She walked until she was in front of him and was able to look up at him. In the dim light, there was a thin layer of moisture in her eyes, making her look extremely fragile. She didn't want to wipe it off. She just looked at him stubbornly and said stubbornly, Qin Anlin, you are mine. He did not move. He just took another puff of his cigarette and said in a hoarse voice, I can't guarantee that. She went forward and wanted to hug him, but her hand was caught by him. He held her fist easily and looked at her with an unfathomable gaze. Yi Liangqiu, you're the one who gave up. Chapter 1696. She lifted her head and her eyes were bathed in tears. She wanted to hug him, but he kept her at a distance. No matter how much he cared for her in front of others, she was the only one who knew that his heart was filled with hatred and he couldn't contain her anymore. He was already extremely kind to her. She stood in the middle of the cold night. It was almost the new year. Outside the window, there would be fireworks every now and then. As the fireworks rose, the light illuminated his handsome face. She could also see the pain and struggle in his eyes. She finally said, "Anlin, at that time, could you forgive me?" What she wanted was a promise from him, but he couldn't give it to her. His voice was slightly cold. "Liangqiu, perhaps I've made you misunderstand me these past few days." He continued calmly, "I've said it before, it's impossible for us to be together. You've adapted well, haven't you?" She stood there stiffly, listening to his words, every word hammered into her heart. Yes, how could she be so naive? How could he forget his mother's death? How could he forget that she was Su Shirqing's daughter? How could he forget that she had brought back a pile of ashes? She had actually thought that he had forgiven her. It turned out that she wasn't the one who had bewitched him. She was the one who had been bewitched. He had always been clear-headed, always. The indulgence he had given her was what he was willing to give her. There was nothing else, really. Perhaps he was more suited to playing games than she was. She took 2 steps back and lightly rubbed her white toes against the cold floor tiles. After a long time, she raised her head and a faint smile appeared on her face. "I understand." She pretended to be relaxed. "Qin Anlin, I was like that just now because of period cramps. I know." His voice was deep. "How can Mr. Yi be so emotional?" He put out his cigarette and looked at her deeply. "I'm leaving." This time, he left without any hesitation, leaving her in the dark. The fireworks outside the window were still burning, one after another, the light from the fire illuminated her face. She stood in the cold and her body was very cold. Finally, she cried like a child. In the middle of the night, she cried her heart out. She couldn't stop. She felt abandoned. When Dr. May came over, she was shocked. "Liangqiu, what's wrong?" Looking at her bare feet, he felt sorry for her and couldn't help but reprimand her. "You're already not feeling well, yet you still don't take care of yourself." Looking at her, Dr. May could roughly guess what was going on. She sighed. "Aunt May, I don't know why you're doing this, but I believe that you love Anlin." He held her shoulders and pulled her into his arms. "Be strong." Yi Liangqiu closed her eyes, but her tears never stopped. After a while, she slowly stepped back and squatted down. "What should I do? I don't want to do that at all. I don't want to see him look at me like a stranger. I don't want to see him with someone else. But I still incite his anger again and again." She clenched her fists. "I thought that I could hold it in, that I wouldn't care so much. I was sure that I was the only one in his heart, but I still feel terrible. It was extremely uncomfortable. With every step she took, she was in danger of losing him completely. He was already telling her that if she continued, he would really dare to have someone else with him. For the first time, she was confused. She wanted to throw caution to the wind, but she just realized how weak she was. Chapter 1697. Yi Liangqiu was at a loss. But she never had a way out. She could only move forward. No matter how painful it was, no matter how scared she was, she could only move forward. She loved him. No matter how painful it was, she couldn't bear to let him know his mother's pain. She loved him. From the bottom of her heart, Qin Anlin was still the man who couldn't sleep. In a woman's heart, she softly treated her man as a child. A few days before the spring festival, Yi Liangqiu stayed at home and didn't go out. She saw Xia Mian's tears on TV and various media, trying to prove that she wasn't the third party. But she didn't deny that there was something between her and Qin Anlin. In the end, she still left some leeway. What was particularly interesting was that she hinted that Qin Anlin and Yi Liangqiu had been separated for more than a year. How could they have a miscarriage after living apart for more than a year? She really admired her intelligence. Yi Liangqiu smiled lightly, took out a CD, and made a call. She called Xia Mian's cell phone on New Year's Eve. The call was quickly connected. Xia Mian picked up the phone. Yi Liangqiu's voice was very calm. "Xia Mian, here's something for you and Che Taixian. You didn't forget it, did you?" Xia Mian was stunned. After a while, she gritted her teeth and said, "Yi Liangqiu, you're despicable." "Really?" Yi Liangqiu smiled lightly. "Now you should prepare how to deal with the media? By the way, Qin Anlin has always known about this." She paused. "From the beginning to the end, he knew everything, including how you climbed into Che Taixian's bed." Xia Mian was stunned. After a long time, she shook her head desperately. She couldn't believe that she had been fooled by Yi Liangqiu. "The role is real. It's up to you whether you can become popular or not. As Yi Liangqiu spoke, she put the CD into the computer and clicked to upload it. Miss Xia, in about half an hour, everyone will be able to appreciate your body and skills. Think about how to deal with it. With that, she hung up the phone. She admitted that she was too impatient. She shouldn't have been so impatient, but she hated Xia Mian. Very much so. She hated Xia Mian sticking to Qin Anlin even more. She admitted that she was petty and despicable, but so what? Yi Liangqiu turned off her laptop. She didn't care how the incident developed, because it was Xia Mian and King Entertainment's business to worry about. It had nothing to do with her. Sitting on the soft sofa and drinking hot tea, a servant carried Silent down. Silently, he became plump and grew a size bigger. He could crawl and even speak a few sentences. It's the new year. You're very happy, aren't you? Yi Liangqiu hugged the little fellow and kissed him. Mommy is very happy too. Little Momo hugged his mother with his chubby arms and repeated her words, happy. Her eyes were curved as she smiled, but there was a loneliness in them that only she understood. Xia Mian's incident had gone viral on the internet. Although the photo was taken from behind, it was obvious that it was Xia Mian from the side. Xia Mian's image of a pure and innocent girl had also taken a nosedive. King Entertainment held an emergency meeting. No matter what, Xia Mian was a popular actress and had been heavily promoted recently. Since this incident had happened, they had to solve it. It wasn't for her, but for the company's reputation. At 10:30 p.m. on New Year's Eve, Qin Anlin sat at the head of the conference table. There was a trace of tiredness and displeasure on his face. Chapter 1698. But she still did it. It was ridiculous and childish. However, he still had to solve this problem. Xia Mian sat with her head down, crying her eyes out. Ing Jie didn't say a word, and Kaim was expressionless. The other executives didn't say anything because they didn't know the relationship between President Qin and Xia Mian. Qin Anlin looked at Xia Mian coldly. Miss Xia, do you want the company to solve this problem, or do you want to solve it yourself? Xia Mian's eyes were red and swollen like a rabbit's. Hearing his words, she looked like she was shocked. After a while, she asked in a low voice, how will the company solve it? Qin Anlin looked straight at her and smiled faintly. Apologize to the public. Apologize to the public for the bad influence our artists have on society. Xia Mian's face turned pale. She looked straight at Qin Anlin and said no in a low voice. But so what? Qin Anlin continued slowly, if you want to solve it yourself, you need to reach a settlement with Che Taixian. Xia Mian's face was pale. Che Taixian had already returned to Korea. How could she reach a settlement? There was only one way for her to go, she was still struggling on her deathbed. All of this is Yi Liangqiu's scheme. As soon as she finished speaking, countless people looked at her with disdain. You're the one who slept with others, right? Now you're accusing others of conspiracy. Did someone force you to go to Che Taixian's bed? Qin Anlin's voice was a little cold. Miss Xia, I only want the result. His attitude was clear to everyone present. The president obviously didn't give face to the White Lotus. It seemed that there was nothing between them. Xia Mian had been talking to herself. Under countless eyes, Xia Mian said with great difficulty, I will give the company an explanation. Qin Anlin looked around and said lightly, that's it. We'll hold a press conference later. Kaim nodded. The reporters are waiting outside. We can hold a press conference at any time. Qin Anlin stood up. Go and get ready. When he reached the door, he suddenly paused and looked straight at Xia Mian. If today's incident doesn't end well, I think you know the consequences. With that, he left without looking back. Xia Mian sat there with an ugly expression on her face. She knew very well what Qin Anlin meant. If they couldn't handle it, she could only sacrifice herself. She stood up and smiled faintly. Yi Liangqiu was really ruthless. She straightened her back. She knew Yi Liangqiu's intention. Wasn't it to block the possibility between her and President Qin? The fact that she was like this was enough to prove the fear in her heart. What was Xia Mian afraid of? She was unmarried. Wasn't it normal for her to have sex with a man? In the CEO's office of King Entertainment, Qin Anlin stood quietly in front of the French windows with a cigarette in his hand. It was 11 o'clock at night. Kaim entered and closed the door behind her. How are things over there? Qin Anlin asked, his voice a little hoarse. Kaim paused. Xia Mian told the reporters that she fell in love with Che Taixian at first sight. That night, she drank too much and naturally slept with him. However, she didn't expect Che Taixian to be such a scumbag. She's smart to deny everything, Qin Anlin sneered. Fortunately, Che Taixian is in Korea. Otherwise, this matter wouldn't be easy to resolve. Kaim nodded in agreement, then sighed. Xia Mian's pure and innocent persona is too tight. President Qin, the company treats her, let's just leave it at that. If we ban her, won't we fall into Yi Liangqiu's trap? Qin Anlin pursed his thin lips. Chapter 1699. Qin Anlin pursed his thin lips. Let's go back first. It's almost midnight. Stay up with your mom. Keim nodded. Qin Anlin asked, how's she doing? Same old, not bad, not good. Keim smiled. Sometimes she's clear-headed, sometimes she's muddle-headed. The nanny takes care of the child. Qin Anlin patted him. You've worked hard. Go back soon. As he said that, he suddenly remembered something and called out to Keim, wait. Keim stopped, a smile on his face. However, it was a lonely smile, especially on a New Year's night because there was one less person. It had been almost 2 years. He hadn't seen her. It wasn't that he didn't want to, but he was afraid that he wouldn't be able to let go. He knew that she had performed well and had her sentence reduced. She had never confessed anything to him. She had never asked him to wait for her. She had only worked hard in silence. Silly Chang Chang. How could she be so silly? What if he was with someone else when she came out? However, even though his heart ached for her, he was satisfied. There was a person who was worth waiting for and waiting for him. He was actually not alone. He had never been. He thought that he should bring He Huan to see her. Keim's face revealed a touch of gentleness. In Qin Anlin's eyes, it was filled with loneliness. Yes, Su Cheng had done so many bad things, but Keim could forgive her. As for him, he couldn't forgive Liangqiu. He couldn't find a reason to forgive her. When Qin Anlin left the company, the ancient bell of a certain building in B City rang. The GM Plaza in front of him burst into cheers and fireworks filled the sky. It was very lively. He stopped and stood there for a long time. The fireworks were lively, but it was also lonely in high school. After watching for a long time, he finally crossed the plaza and got into his car. As he sat in the car and slowly fastened his seat belt, the side door opened and Xia Mian came in. Qin Anlin frowned at Xia Mian and said coldly, "Get out of the car." Xia Mian clenched her fists and her eyes became watery. "President Qin, I was framed." Qin Anlin's slender fingers gripped the steering wheel tightly. "So what? Other than proving that your IQ is not high enough, what else can it prove? It was Yi Liangqiu who was too despicable?" Xia Mian bit her lip and said, but Qin Anlin had no intention of listening to her. He said coldly, "Get out of the car. Otherwise, starting tomorrow, you will no longer be an artist of King Entertainment." This was the limit of his tolerance. Xia Mian still wanted to say something, but his voice was low and hoarse. "Get out of here." It was rare for him to be this angry. Xia Mian, on the other hand, disgusted him. He thought that he had overestimated her. She didn't even have the basic qualities of an artist. At this moment, Qin Anlin had made a decision in his heart. Xia Mian was startled, and her body trembled. She didn't dare to stay any longer. With her fingers on the door handle, she hesitated and got out of the car. As soon as she got out, the car drove away in a puff of smoke, leaving behind a cloud of dust. Qin Anlin drove with one hand. He glanced sideways at the place where Xia Mian had been sitting, feeling a little annoyed. The black sports car sped through the night. Along the road, there were people setting off firecrackers and fireworks. The sound was like boiling water. His expression became even colder as he drove all the way to the Qin family's old mansion. He drove onto a kapok road. The kapok trees on both sides were a little bleak because of the winter, and the lights were dim. Chapter 1700. The lights of the mansion lit up in an instant, and the black carved door slowly slid open. He drove in and parked the car on the lawn in front of the main mansion. In fact, Xia Mian's matter wasn't that important. He didn't have to solve it himself, but he still made a big deal out of it. He thought that he just didn't dare to come back. He was afraid of loneliness, and he was even more afraid of facing a home with one less person. When he entered the door with his coat, he saw Su Qingxiu sitting on the sofa. Her face, which was no longer young, was in a daze. "Aunt Su, you're not asleep yet?" Qin Anlin asked softly, his voice a little hoarse. Su Qingxiu was shocked and looked up at him. Perhaps it was because she was old, or because she had cried too much in the past 2 years, her eyes weren't good. She squinted for a long time before she could see Qin Anlin clearly. Then, she sighed. "The old lady is gone. Why didn't you come back earlier for the new year?" Qin Anlin smiled apologetically. "I had something important to deal with in the company, so I came back late." He wanted to change the topic. "Mumu and Muyun are asleep, right?" "They're all asleep. Muyun takes good care of little Mumu." Su Qingxiu forced a smile and then scolded, Look at you, as a father. You don't even know how to spend the new year with your child. You're busy in the company. What's the big deal? Qin Anlin smiled and didn't say anything. Su Qingxiu still doted on him. Seeing his tired look, she said, "It's cold. I'll get someone to bring a bowl of mutton soup over. It'll warm up your body." Qin Anlin was also hungry, so he didn't refuse. He casually put his coat on the sofa and let out a long breath. Su Qingxiu went to bring the mutton soup. The house was quiet. The house was still the same. Today was the midnight of the new year, but there was really nothing new in the house. Looking around, he saw a photo of his mother on the coffee table. There were a few balls of tissue in the trash can. Aunt Su must have cried again. Qin Anlin shook his head helplessly. He took the photo with his slender fingers and looked at it for a long time. Su Qingxiu held the plate at the door and stood quietly. Her voice was a little choked. "I've been with the old lady for so many years. The old lady left, and I was supposed to follow her." Qin Anlin raised his eyes and looked at the sleeve. He sighed, "Aunt Su, don't say that. It makes me feel worse." Crisp Sleeve came in and placed the plate on the table. Qin Anlin, however, lost his appetite and forced himself to eat. Su Xiu sat beside him and wiped her tears. "I should have gone, but I thought about how old mistress disappeared for no reason. I haven't taken revenge yet. How can I be satisfied?" Qin Anlin's heart sank. He seemed to understand Qingxiu's intentions. He put down the chopsticks in his hand and looked at Qingxiu. Chu Xiu's face darkened as she slowly said, "Young master, I had a dream last night." Qin Anlin grunted and looked at Milky Sleeve. "And then, I dreamed of the old lady. The old lady said that she was not living well over there." Qingxiu wiped her tears. "Poor old lady. She still thinks about young master. She was afraid that you would be lonely, so she asked me to help you find a reliable girl." Qin Anlin lowered his eyes and smiled faintly. "Aunt Su, you're confused. I'm not single." Qingxiu looked at him with her blurry eyes again. After looking at him for a long time, she shook her head. "Old mistress said that she didn't dare to want a daughter-in-law like that." Chapter 1701. He paused and said in a clear voice, "Is there any difference between our relationship now and separation? The old lady's soul will be uneasy as long as she is in the Qin family's account." There was a hint of pain in Qingxiu's voice. "Young master, have you forgotten how the old lady died in vain? But I don't dare to forget for a moment." She trembled and stroked her silver hair. "I don't even dare to die. I'm afraid that I won't be able to see the end of the wicked if I die." At this moment, her expression was a little frightened and pitiful. Qin Anlin knew that she had been with the old lady since she was a child and had a deep relationship. It was normal for her to be a little extreme. He didn't want to hurt her too much, so he sighed. "There will be such a day." Qingxiu looked at him as if her eyes were on fire. "What will happen to you, Liangqiu, at that time? You will still be together, won't you? Don't you care about the old lady's feelings in the netherworld? She is the daughter of your enemy. Can you still hold her and love her until your hair turns white?" Her voice was a little harsh at the end of the sentence. Qin Anlin was very tired and smiled bitterly. "Aunt Su, I won't. I said that I won't forgive her." He was in a trance as he said this. Won't forgive her? Really? In fact, how many chances had he given her since she came back? But she didn't want to give him a chance. Qin Anlin restrained his expression and said lightly, "Aunt Su, take good care of yourself. Don't worry too much." He patted her shoulder. "The old lady will also hope that you live a good life in your old age." Qingxiu's tears flowed down. "The old lady is gone. What's the use of living a good life for me?" Qin Anlin didn't say anything because his heart was even sadder than hers. The dead were gone, and the living were still suffering. Over the past year or so, every day and every second had been spent in torment. He hated her, missed her, blamed her, and he couldn't tell anyone about it. If he said it, it would be unfilial. He slowly unbuttoned his suit and walked upstairs. Qingxiu stood downstairs and looked at him. In the dim light, she seemed to see him when he was a child. In the blink of an eye, he had grown up. "Young master, you must avenge the old lady." Her voice was hoarse, which made his heart tighten. Qin Anlin thought that it was time to find a suitable place for Qingxiu to live in. She was no longer suitable to live here. If she continued to live here, she would become useless. As he was thinking, he untied his tie and walked gently into the children's room. Muyun and Mumu were both asleep. Mumu was held in his brother's arms. He was obedient and sleeping soundly. He pulled off his tie, sat gently on the bed, reached out to touch Mumu's face, and then touched Muyun's forehead. Muyun woke up. She opened her eyes and looked at Qin Anlin in a daze. She murmured, "Daddy." Qin Anlin smiled faintly and reached out to rub his little head. Why are you awake? Today is New Year's Eve. Daddy, I want to set off fireworks. Mu Yun's voice was soft, not as cold as usual. Qin Anlin lowered his head and kissed him on the cheek. It's past midnight. It's already the new year. However, he was willing to fulfill his wish. Get dressed. Daddy will take you downstairs to set off the fireworks, okay? Yi Muyun's eyes were stained with something like fireworks. Although he was excited, he still remembered that his sister was still asleep. He got up quietly, put on his clothes, and followed Qin Anlin downstairs. Chapter 1702. The cold night and the lively sky formed a sharp contrast. Qin Anlin watched from afar with Yi Muyun, watching the lively blooming in the sky. It's so beautiful? Yi Muyun whispered, Mommy must like it too. Qin Anlin reached out and picked up his son so that he could have a better view. After a long time, he murmured, Yes, your mommy likes it too. However, they separated after a year or two. No matter how much she liked it, they couldn't stand together to enjoy the fireworks. More than 10 fireworks were set off in turn. The sky bloomed with beauty again and again, but after it was over, all that was left was loneliness. Qin Anlin stood for a long time before he lowered his head and looked at his son. Go back to sleep, okay? It was rare that Yi Muyun didn't listen to him. I want to call Mommy. As soon as he finished speaking, his father's body stiffened. After a long time, he sighed softly. Muyun, it's late. Mommy is already asleep. Aren't we not asleep too? Little Muyun's height reached Qin Anlin's waist. He raised his little face and asked. He didn't look like his usual cold self. Instead, he looked like a child who longed for his mother. No matter how hard Qin Anlin's heart was, he couldn't bear to do that, so he took out his phone and gave it to Muyun. In fact, how could he not know that Muyun could use the home phone to call him himself? He was just looking for a chance to enjoy the feeling of having a father and mother. How could he have the heart to disappoint him? Muyun took the phone. His little body squatted there. When he spoke, his voice was also soft, and he looked at Qin Anlin from time to time. Qin Anlin was taken aback by the look in her eyes. He silently walked to the side and lit a cigarette. Little Muyun spoke for about 10 minutes before returning the phone to him. Qin Anlin looked down. It was already hung up. What did he say? With a cigarette in one hand, he took a puff and walked home with his son in the other. Muyun snorted vaguely. Daddy, I want to sleep. With that, his little face pressed against Qin Anlin's waist, looking like he was going to sleep. Qin Anlin patted his little head, feeling helpless and amused at the same time. This child. He carried the little guy upstairs and tucked him in. Little Muyun secretly opened his eyes. Qin Anlin was both angry and amused. He reached out and pinched his little face. All right, it's time to sleep. Otherwise, I'm going to spank your butt. Little Muyun laughed and hugged his sister as if he was holding a little toy. And kissed her. Qin Anlin's heart softened, and he tucked the two of them in. Just as he was about to leave, Muyun's voice sounded softly. Daddy, will Mommy come back? Qin Anlin's body stiffened. After a long time, he smiled gently. She will always be your mother. Muyun didn't say anything else and carefully said good night. Qin Anlin walked back and kissed the little guy's face. Good night. He got up and hugged him with a pair of little hands. The child was tall and had long arms. Hugging him felt light. Qin Anlin was reluctant and couldn't bear to let him go. Muyun never made a fuss or begged him, but it didn't mean that he didn't miss his mother. And he had been merciful to her many times. It couldn't be said that he didn't consider the child. He stayed with the little guy for a while. When he fell asleep, Qin Anlin walked out quietly. Chapter 1703. This place was still the same as before. There were red candles on the dressing table, which were used when his parents got married. She still kept them carefully. It could be seen that she had never forgotten that heartless man. Qin Anlin let out a low sigh. He carefully cleaned the bedroom and sat for another half an hour or so. This could be considered companionship. When he returned to his bedroom, he couldn't fall asleep. His body was very tired, but his consciousness was very clear. Over the years, his insomnia had never been better. He sat up, walked to the bar in the living room, poured himself a glass of red wine, and sat on the sofa by the French window, looking at the night view outside. He sat there for half the night. He held his phone in his hand and occasionally looked at it. But it was almost dawn, and he still hadn't received any messages. He smiled bitterly. What was he looking forward to? It was time to clean up the debt with the Su family and her feelings. Qin Anlin slowly got up and looked at the morning scenery outside with a slightly bitter gaze. The morning light was shrouded in a thin mist, looking a little cold. In the vast expanse of whiteness, there were branches with broken leaves, standing there alone. Qin Anlin felt that the tree was a little like him. He smiled lightly, a little bitterly. During the New Year, he asked Yi Liangqiu to meet on the second day of the Chinese New Year, which could be regarded as a reunion for the children. The location was still his apartment. Su Qingxiu didn't go, because she would probably be unhappy if she went. Qin Anlin hired 2 professional nannies, both of whom were confirmed by Keim for a long time before they took up the job. Qin Anlin was relatively relieved to use them. On the afternoon of the second day of the Chinese New Year, Yi Liangqiu came over, pushing a small cart. Silence was inside. Qin Anlin hugged Silence, while Yi Liangqiu gave the gifts she brought to Mu Yun and Mumu. Especially Mumu, she felt a little sad when she hugged him. After all, he was a little girl who was born without a mother. Although Anlin took good care of him, Yi Liangqiu still felt a little worried. After hugging and kissing him for a while, she put him down reluctantly. The nanny will take care of him. To the supermarket. Qin Anlin's voice was a little stiff. She looked up at him. What are you doing there? Qin Anlin had already walked to the door. His tone was very indifferent. Grocery shopping. She let out an ah as he stood at the door. His tone became even more indifferent. If not, what are we eating tonight? Only then did Yi Liangqiu let out an oh and walked out. He took his coat and car keys. When he saw her coming out, he opened the door and walked out first. She followed behind him because she couldn't bear to part with the children. It wasn't easy for them to see each other, and he had to take her out again. But she didn't dare to go against him, because if she dared to, he might not let her see the child again. He started the car and said calmly, "You should know what happened to Xia Mian." She grunted, but did not say anything else. "What do you think?" His voice was still indifferent. Yi Liangqiu looked up at him. "You want me to invite Che Taixian back to avoid the rumors? To say that he and Xia Mian are actually in a business relationship?" Qin Anlin snorted coldly. "You're really good at joking." After that, he stopped talking about Xia Mian and asked her what she wanted to eat. Yi Liangqiu was a little confused. She turned her head to look out of the window, bit her thumb, and said in a very indifferent voice, "Will you make it?" After asking, there was a long silence. After a long time, Qin Anlin sighed. "Liangqiu, will you give it to me?" Chapter 1704. He squinted his eyes and smiled faintly. Then, he answered her question seriously, "I'll do it." The atmosphere was different. She only responded with and didn't say anything else. When they reached the supermarket, she followed beside him, keeping a step away from him. They were so unfamiliar. At first, he didn't mind and let her do as she pleased, choosing the ingredients by himself. After 2 o'clock in the afternoon, there were more and more people at the supermarket. In the end, it was so crowded that it was almost crowded. Yi Liangqiu was a little dumbfounded. Didn't these people need to celebrate the New Year? The crowd had separated the two of them, and they were now about 2 meters apart. Perhaps she had something in her heart, so she thought it was good that they got separated. She would wait for him at the entrance of the supermarket. But just as she made up her mind, he was already walking beside her, reaching out to grab her and drag her to his side. Yi Liangqiu was startled and looked at him. "Hold my hand, don't get separated." His voice was slightly cold and indifferent. She pursed her lips, her fingers gripping his cuff. Then, he threw his coat to her and asked her to hold it. This time, they were like an ordinary married couple, walking in the crowded supermarket and struggling to choose the dishes for dinner. Most of the time, she was in a daze, and he was in charge of choosing the dishes. When they were done, it was already 4 o'clock in the afternoon. He put the last vegetable into the shopping cart. His handsome face was still handsome, but there were some beads of sweat on his forehead. Yi Liangqiu just looked at him and didn't say anything. When they went to the front desk to settle the bill, he naturally reached out to her. "Wallet." She let out an ah and looked at him. "It's in the coat." His tone was calm, but his eyes were focused on her face. She was wearing a thick coat with a hat. Her long hair covered half of her face, so it was hard to tell that she was Yi Liangqiu. "Oh," he said. She quickly flipped the jacket over and took out his wallet to hand it to him. Qin Anlin paid and they went to the parking lot. She sat in the car while he moved the things into the trunk. The car swayed slightly, and she felt a little uneasy. 5 minutes later, he got into the car with a gust of cold air. His body sank into the seat, and the back of the seat made a slight sound. "Bring me a bottle of water," he ordered her. She was in a daze again. Then, as if she had bounced up, she awkwardly handed the water to him. Qin Anlin seemed to be a little hot. He opened the bottle of mineral water in the cold winter and drank half a bottle in one go. He put down the bottle and started the car. At the same time, he said slowly, you seem very nervous. No. She looked out the window and sighed softly. I'm just lamenting that we can still get along so peacefully. He was silent for a while before he said, in front of the child, we are still family, and we have to be like this. Then, he said something that shocked her. He looked at her and said calmly, no matter what happens to us in the end, the child must have a mother and father. She shuddered and looked at him in disbelief. The winner takes all, and you know it too. So the loser in the end, doesn't have the right to ask for forgiveness. His voice was cold, but the meaning behind it couldn't be clearer. He said that he wouldn't forgive her, and they would never be able to. But now. Chapter 1705. In front of a red light, Qin Anlin stopped the car and turned his face. His voice was even colder. Yi Liangqiu? I think you think the same as me. Her voice trembled as she called out Anlin. She couldn't believe that he would say that. What he meant was that no matter what happened in the future, they would still be together, even if the way they interacted wasn't the same as before. And this, to her, was already a great gift. Yes, she was so humble that she was no longer herself. He didn't make a sound. His expression was a little solemn, as if he was angry with her. In fact, he was angry with himself. The atmosphere in the car became solemn again. Then, he drove with one hand and took a cigarette from the central control with the other. He lit it up. The smell of smoke quickly filled the car, and Yi Liangqiu coughed a few times. He opened the window a little, looked at her sideways, and didn't say anything. He put out the cigarette and waited for the smoke to dissipate before closing the window. The car entered the traffic again, and his tone was calm. After the festival, I will ask Kaim to go to ATV to discuss the cooperation. She immediately keenly sensed what he meant, and looked at him sideways. Is it an acquisition? He just glanced at her indifferently and didn't answer, but silence often meant acquiescence. ATV won't agree. Her voice was soft but firm. He smiled. I know, but I thought that in the end, you would agree. Yi Liangqiu pursed her lips. Although I'm the CEO of ATV, I don't have ATV shares in my hands. Qin Anlin's gaze was slightly cold. Then when the time comes, get Su Shicheng to come out. Yi Liangqiu also sneered. Wait until President Qin forces ATV to a dead end before saying that. After a while, she snorted softly. I think that even if that day comes, with Su Shicheng's personality, he would rather abandon the entire ATV than let it belong to King Entertainment. Su Shicheng was insidious, but he was also proud. Qin Anlin didn't know, but Yi Liangqiu clearly knew how much Su Shicheng cared about the Qin family. After she finished speaking, Qin Anlin's eyes shone and his voice was a little hoarse. What about you? Are you going to advance and retreat with him in ATV? Yi Liangqiu rolled down the window and looked out. Then she turned her head. No. At that time, I will come back and you can do whatever you want with me. After she said that, his body actually tensed up for a moment, and he had an indescribable urge. Do whatever you want to me, what a beautiful word. He unbuttoned the top 2 buttons of his shirt with one hand and said in a hoarse voice, You said it. She turned her head and looked at him tenderly. Anlin, I'm sorry. I can only win, I can't lose. Her words probably made him feel a little better, so he didn't make things difficult for her anymore. After driving the car back, he dismissed the 2 nannies and asked Yi Liangqiu to take care of the children while he went to the kitchen to prepare the ingredients. Mumu and Momo were both babies, so they had milk a few times a day. At 6 o'clock, the 2 babies were hungry. Yi Liangqiu went to the kitchen to make milk. When she opened the fridge, her gaze froze. The fridge was filled with all kinds of ingredients. And before he went to the supermarket today, he said that there were no ingredients. She turned around, and Qin Anlin, who was sitting in front of the counter, looked at her indifferently. I remembered wrongly. Chapter 1706. Yi Liangqiu nodded her head. When she turned around, the corners of her lips curled into a faint smile. He didn't mean what he said. It was clearly not like that. However, she did not refute him. She closed the fridge, walked behind him and leaned forward. Where's the milk? He was handling the ingredients. When he heard that, he turned to look at her and opened the cabinet door. Upstairs? Oh, Yi Liangqiu replied and walked over to get it. He was leaning sideways. After she walked over, he turned around again. In this way, it was equivalent to him trapping her between himself and the counter. In just an instant, her body froze. She did not dare to turn sideways. Her nose was filled with his masculine scent. Behind her, she was touching his body. It was so warm that it was almost scalding. She paused for a moment and tiptoed to get the milk powder from the cabinet. When her fingers touched it, her waist was caught by him, her fingers trembled, and so did his voice. Anlin. Following that, she was hugged tightly in his arms. His lips touched her neck and his voice was a little hoarse. Don't you have anything to say to me? Say what? Her voice was a little faint. After that, her neck was bitten and her sweater was lifted, every inch of her skin was aroused by his big palms. Her lower lip quivered as she called out his name. Her body was turned around and she sat on the counter. The cold surface of the counter temporarily calmed her down a little. She wanted to get down, but he did not allow her to. His body was stuck between hers. He lowered his body and buried his face in her neck. Anything else? He asked in a hoarse voice. She suddenly blushed and looked up. Her gaze was light, and there was a touch of moisture in it. She did not make a sound, but he knew it. His lips kissed her lightly and moved to her lips. She was a little uneasy, but it was not that she was unwilling. They were both adults, and it was a once in a long time. Hence, he was excited, and she was especially passionate. It was as passionate as the last time. In the end, the counter was completely ruined. It was a mess, and there was no way to eat. When everything had calmed down, he was still standing with his arm around her waist. Both of them were panting slightly. Yiliangqiu buried her face in his chest, her skin touching his shirt. His sweat was all over it and it was slightly cold. After the sudden sexual incident, the atmosphere was a little subtle, but no one said anything, or perhaps they had already tacitly agreed. The game between them was too lonely, so it was understandable that they chose to temporarily comfort each other. After a long time, he finally left, and she immediately felt the chill in the air. He tidied himself up and took a tissue to clean her up. But those dishes couldn't be eaten, let alone looked at. They were all swept into the trash can, and everything had to start over. Yiliangqiu washed her hands and made milk powder. The two babies were as hungry as calves. As she fed him, she thought about what had just happened. Her face was burning hot. After feeding, she was too ashamed to go to the kitchen to wash the milk bottle. In the end, little Muyun sneakily took it to the kitchen. Qin Anlin took it and glanced at it. Then, he said shyly, how could he not know what she was thinking? She was probably embarrassed. In fact, when they were in the car, he wanted her, half of it was because he wanted her, and the other half was because he was a little angry. Chapter 1707. She had not slept in their bedroom for a long time. Although they had sex in the kitchen in the afternoon, it had only been a few minutes. If he wanted to be quick, there was nothing he couldn't solve. At this moment, she looked at the bathroom door, clutching her bathrobe. She was even more nervous than their first time. The bathroom door was pulled open and a slender figure walked out. Qin Anlin was drying his hair with a towel. He walked over slowly. Why didn't you take a shower? He was taking a shower just now. Yiliangqiu entered the bathroom. The bathroom was filled with steam and the faint smell of shower gel. She took a quick shower, but hesitated as she went out. After a long time, she thought that he was asleep and walked out. But the moment she stepped out of the bathroom, she was hugged. Then she was pressed against the bathroom door. Her back hurt, and before she could scream, her lips were blocked. He seemed to be in a hurry as he blocked her lips and got his way. It was probably because it was very convenient and it was late at night after a shower. It was not like the time in the kitchen. But after satisfying his craving, he wanted to torture her. They hadn't done this for a long time. Her long hair was untied and spread hopelessly on the pillow. He kissed her bit by bit, making her feel hot. Seeing that she was in a frenzy because of him, the emptiness in his heart was slightly filled. At first, it was gentle and unrestrained love, but later, he became ferocious and tortured her for the whole night. At dawn, they hugged each other tiredly. Then he remembered that he didn't have any protection tonight and she wasn't in her safe period. She lay in his arms and felt his tension. She probably guessed what he was thinking. So she said softly, I will take the medicine. His body became even more tense. After a long time, he said in a low voice, don't take it. If you are pregnant, then let's give birth. Yiliangqiu was a little surprised. He knew? Qin Anlin's voice was a little low. Won't taking the medicine cause menstrual cramps? It won't happen if you pay attention. She sighed softly and turned her back to him. She wanted to cry, not for herself, but for him. She clung to his warmth, but he had gone through so much struggle to hug her. Even if he didn't say it, she knew. Their union was originally sinful, in his heart. But she couldn't say anything. He hugged her from behind, but she didn't struggle and let him hug her. His face was buried in her neck, and his voice was a little hoarse. Yiliangqiu, you have to live well, because I haven't forgiven you. Her body trembled. After a long time, she choked back her sobs. Qin Anlin, you too. They could only use this method to love and kill each other. Perhaps this was the only way to alleviate the evil in their hearts and make it easier for them to hug and comfort each other in this dark night. The sky gradually brightened, but they hugged each other and slept until it was almost noon. When they woke up, their expressions were thought-provoking. His voice was a little hoarse. Sleep a little longer. He stood up. Yi Liangqiu held his hand and hesitated for a moment. Help me buy medicine. His eyes were burning. Are you sure? She didn't say anything. He kindly reminded her, if you have another child, your life might be better in the future. She snorted coldly. I might not lose. He smiled. Let's wait and see. However, he still respected her wishes and bought the medicine for her. On the way back, he specially called Dr. May to confirm that the medicine would be fine. Dr. May was a little speechless. Didn't they say that they hated each other? It had only been a few days, and they were together again. Chapter 1708. Qin Anlin looked at her deeply and went out. Half an hour later, he came back with a small box of morning-after medicine in his hand. When she took it, he reminded her again, you can't take this medicine often. Remind me to take precautions in the future. Yi Liangqiu lowered her head and didn't say anything. She just ate the medicine quietly. He was annoyed and walked to the door. I'm going to cook. After taking the medicine, Yi Liangqiu looked in the direction of the door. After a while, he came back. There was breakfast in his hand, which was her favorite. I haven't brushed my teeth. She looked up at him. Qin Anlin's gaze was calm. Put it here and go brush your teeth. He paused and said stiffly, lie down after eating. This time, he really left. She could occasionally hear him talking to the children from afar, but her heart was incomparably satisfied. She understood that this was the best he could do for her. She should be satisfied and not be greedy. It was his struggle, his pain, his hatred that came and went with her, that came and went with her. She thought about comforting him. But in this world, she was the one who was least qualified to comfort him. Perhaps, every time she obeyed his wishes and gave in to his body, it was partly because of guilt. Hugging the quilt, she ate the breakfast he bought and lay down for a while. Indeed, her legs were sore and a little painful. It was as if he had eaten the last meal and didn't know the next one. Lying down like that, she actually fell asleep. When she woke up, it was already 2 in the afternoon. There was a faint smell of food in the air. She sat up and felt that her body was a little sticky. When she touched it, she found that it was all sweaty. As soon as she woke up, Qin Anlin came in and looked at his watch. You slept for 3 hours? She was a little surprised. Have the children eaten? He replied absent-mindedly. Looking at her sweaty forehead, he frowned. Go take a shower and eat. After a pause, he said, I have something to do in the afternoon. I'll send you back later. Yi Liangqiu's body stiffened. The quilt was originally very warm, but now it was as cold as ice. Just like that, 2 beautiful and peaceful days passed by quickly. Was this the last warmth of his charity? Yi Liangqiu pursed her lips and nodded. Okay. She went to the bathroom and unbuttoned her pajamas. Standing under the shower, her eyes were a little sore. I promise not to cry. His body was pushed away by something, and behind him was a cold wall. He was wearing a shirt. At this moment, it was already a mess. It stuck to Jing's sturdy body, and also stuck to her. The thin layer of fabric couldn't block anything. She could feel the heat of every inch of his skin. She raised her head, and the water droplets flowed down her cheeks, to her neck, and finally to her beautiful collarbone. She looked up at him hopelessly. His eyes were burning. Her fair fingers tightened around his shoulders, and his shirt tightened under her hands. She pressed her face gently against his chest, pursing her lips tightly, and hugged him just like that. He was very restrained, but soon after, he didn't hold back anymore. He leaned forward and kissed her lips. Once Yu Wang's floodgates were opened, he couldn't control himself anymore. He held her shoulders, and his handsome face was a little twisted. After that, he vented all his frustrations on her body. Chapter 1709. When everything calmed down, her body softly rested on his shoulder. Because of the pain, she bit him, and he carried her to the bathroom to wash her up. He then helped her put on her clothes. She knew that this was his last act of tenderness. She hugged him, her body so soft that he didn't want to let go. But even if he didn't want to let go, he had to. When she finished her meal, he walked her home himself. Yi Liangqiu stood at the gate of the Su mansion, and watched him leave with her own eyes. The black sports car sped away. She stood there in a daze for a while. The next day, she found out that he had gone abroad with Xia Mian to a high-end fashion show in Paris, France. In the live broadcast, the officials gave him a close-up, so she could see clearly that it was Qin Anlin. He walked down the red carpet with Xia Mian, and they looked like a perfect match. He was wearing a formal suit, while Xia Mian was wearing a starry Dior dress. She looked very beautiful and elegant. Yi Liangqiu sat on the sofa and watched quietly. She knew that Xia Mian hadn't been abandoned by King Entertainment. She could tell from the fact that Qin Anlin escorted her personally. And behind all of this was Yi Liangqiu's previous identity as a celebrity. Xia Mian? Yi Liangqiu smiled faintly. 2 days after Qin Anlin went to France, something happened to Kaim's family. Kaim's mother had a stroke 2 years ago. This time, the weather was too cold. One night, the heater in the bedroom wasn't turned on, but the nanny didn't care. Mother he then left the world. When she left, she was very peaceful. Kaim went to France with Qin Anlin and couldn't make it for a while. Kaim's hometown was very far away. After the nanny called her husband, Kaim asked Yi Liangqiu to take care of the family for him while he rushed back. In fact, Qin Anlin and Kaim had important business in France. They weren't going to walk the red carpet. When Kaim returned to China, Qin Anlin couldn't leave and stayed in France. Yi Liangqiu was in B City. According to the information provided by Kaim, she contacted Kaim's relatives in his hometown and arranged for a special car to pick them up and a hotel. In addition, Mama He's funeral arrangements had been made. She had done all this not only because of her relationship with Kaim, but also because of Su Cheng. Su Cheng would be able to come out after 8 years, but now, Mama He had left. How could they not sigh? Mrs. He had always been against Su Cheng and Kaim. Now that she was gone, Su Cheng should meet her. It was her last consolation to He Mingming's mother. Perhaps, He Mingming's mother had already succumbed to her son. After all, in the past 2 years, she had never mentioned setting up a blind date for Kaim. Yi Liangqiu used all her connections to get Su Cheng to come out for 2 days. Su Cheng had arrived that night. Kaim arrived at the same time. They met downstairs. He was covered in dust and grief, but he couldn't hide his elite aura. As for her, she was wearing a cheap and simple down jacket. Her long hair had been cut short, and she looked like a little girl from the countryside. She didn't look like a little princess at all. Her face was no longer as delicate as it used to be. Su Cheng's lips trembled slightly. She stood there and didn't go forward for a long time. Kaim stopped in his tracks and looked at her intently for a long time. Finally, he took a step forward and said, "Go in." He reached out and held her hand. Su Cheng's hand tightened. She looked up and looked into the distance. They hadn't seen each other for almost a year and a half. The feeling of being together was almost forgotten, but at this moment, he held her hand. It turned out that the past had always been there. Chapter 17:10. Su Cheng lowered her head and looked at the pair of large palms that were holding onto her hands. A thin layer of mist appeared over her eyes. She was hesitating because she was still serving her sentence. Could she really go see his mother? Her footsteps paused and Kaim knew what she was thinking. He did not stop and chose to take the stairs. After climbing more than 10 flights of stairs, he managed to convince her in that short 5 minutes. In the end, my mother agreed. His gaze softly told her. Su Cheng's palms were sweaty and slippery. She instinctively tightened her grip on Kaim's hand. He was in front while she was below him. She could look up at his back. Cheng, call me Shuheng from now on." When they reached the entrance of his apartment, he turned around and looked at her. His face was solemn, but there was a gentleness in his eyes. She could understand that gentleness, but it was unfamiliar. Her long prison life had long since worn away her pride and drive. The current Su Cheng was no longer the same person she used to be. Even when she stood beside him, she looked crude. She replied with an mm. However, when she looked up at the high-class door, she became timid again. Now, she had nothing and her identity was like this. His apartment was filled with his family. She was afraid that others would look at her in that way. What she was even more afraid of was that they would look down on him because of her. Su Cheng hesitated, but her hand was held tightly. Kaim's voice was firm. "For me, you and He Huan are the people closest to me." He Huan? Their child's name was He Huan? Su Cheng felt like crying. She did not even know her child's name. "Let's see him." Kaim smiled bitterly. "I'll go see my mother one last time in a while." He opened the door firmly. Inside the apartment was his family. Under the many questioning gazes, his hand did not let go of Su Cheng's hand. A sharp cry rang out. It was his little aunt's voice of disapproval. She had objected on behalf of his mother. However, he had made his choice clear. He personally put a small white flower on Su Cheng's head. Together with him, as her son and daughter-in-law, she sent He Mingming's mother on her last journey. Amidst the flames, he burst into tears. Su Cheng turned to look at him and pressed her face against his chest. Before the cemetery was completed, Mrs. He's ashes were stored in the Anling Tower. After sending off his relatives, Keim thanked Yi Liangqiu. The car stopped in front of the apartment, and Yi Liangqiu got off. She looked at them and smiled faintly. I'm not going up. My condolences, Keim. Keim nodded. Su Cheng held his arm, and her gaze seemed light under the moonlight. At that moment, it was as if the old Su Cheng had returned. Yi Liangqiu watched quietly, then waved her hand. I'll come over tomorrow afternoon. Su Cheng's eyes were red as she called out to Liangqiu. Yi Liangqiu felt bad too. She nodded and walked over to Su Cheng. She reached out to wipe the tears off her face. Silly girl, why are you crying? It wasn't easy for us to see each other. She looked up at Keim again. She was afraid that Keim's mother would leave. She was afraid that Keim would be emotionally unstable. Fortunately, Keim knew his mother's health better than anyone else. Perhaps this accident was within his expectations. He nodded at Yi Liangqiu, and Yi Liangqiu was relieved. She got into the car and left. On the way out, she wound down the car window and let the night breeze caress her face. Chapter 17:11. Before she knew it, her face was already covered in tears. These tears were for Su Cheng, but how could it not be for herself? Meanwhile, downstairs, Keim slowly held onto Su Cheng's hand. His gaze fell on her face, which was no longer fair, but rather a little dark. She seemed to have matured a little, and was no longer as childish as before. She was somewhat mature, so mature that it made his heart ache. Perhaps this was the reason why he had not dared to look at her for the past year. Cheng, let's go home. His voice was soft. She could not believe it. Home? Could she really do it? My mom agreed. Didn't you hear what she said? Keim's voice was rather relaxed, and there was no special sorrow in it. It was also because Mama He's health had not been good these past few years, and she was often sick. Sometimes, it was a form of relief for her to leave. When he said that, Su Cheng stopped in her tracks. She looked left and right, and the expression on her face was much more varied. She did not look like she had when she first came back. Did she say it? She swallowed hard, and her face was filled with, "Don't scare me." Keim smiled faintly. I heard it anyway. They walked into the elevator, and when they reached his floor, they opened the door and entered. As soon as they entered, she was dragged inside, and her body was pressed against the heavy door. He hugged her, and his head was pressed against her neck as he breathed lightly. He didn't say a word. He just hugged her, hugging her gently. At first, Su Cheng was not used to it. After all, they had not seen each other for a long time. It was a little strange, and she was also a little shy. But after a while, her hands hesitantly hugged his waist, and her face was buried in his shoulder. Just like that, the hug became tighter and tighter. Finally, as if he could not control himself, he kissed her lips. It was as if all the passion had been ignited. This kiss was light at first, mixed with the pain of his mother's death, and the long-lost feelings. At first, she did not dare to respond to him, and she had forgotten how it felt. But he was very patient, and he led her over and over again. Finally, her hands climbed up his neck. He lifted her up and carried her to his bedroom. She covered her eyes with her hands, not daring to look at him. Shuhing, don't, why? He firmly removed her hand, intertwined his fingers with hers, and fell down together. His gaze was gentle as he took off her coat and sweater with one hand and threw them at the end of the bed. Then it was his, piling up one by one, until it became a mess. She put her hand over her heart nervously. Don't look. Why? His voice was hoarse. Why won't you watch? Su Cheng's voice trembled. Because it's ugly. Her body was no longer as beautiful as it was in the past. After giving birth, there were some fine lines on her body. It was very ugly. Even she felt that she was ugly, let alone a man. However, Keim firmly removed her hand and raised it high above her head. She closed her eyes in shame and turned her face away. Don't look. Cheng, you're beautiful, really. He moved closer to her ear. Tonight is not a good time, but I miss you. The two of them only had this one night. She did not know when they would meet again. Even He Huan, she only glanced at him from afar. She refused to look anymore and let someone carry her away. How could he not know what she was thinking? Although the child was young, she did not want it to be tainted by her. Chapter 17:12. Just as he had said, it wasn't a good time. But after tonight, there wouldn't be another night like this. He was very gentle, afraid that he would scare her. Su Cheng wasn't the Su Cheng of the past. She had been extremely reserved the entire night. She was extremely jerky, but it was precisely this jerkiness that made her look especially gentle and alluring. After a few rounds, she lay in his arms, drenched in sweat, her slender arms wrapped around his waist. She was obviously very sleepy, but she couldn't bear to sleep. Kaim was the same. He was leaning against the headboard, holding a cigarette in his hand. He didn't smoke much, and his gaze was lowered as he looked at her. Su Cheng looked up, her eyes glistening. "Shuheng, if there's a good woman, then let's get together. Don't worry about me." Kaim paused, his gaze lowered as he looked at her for a long time. After a long time, he finally said, "Are you sure?" There was a hint of imperceptible sternness in his voice. Su Cheng grunted and said slowly, "I still have 8 years left. I can't get any more reductions." "So, you're afraid of dragging me down. Is that so?" he asked very softly. Su Cheng didn't deny it. "Then what are you doing now? Did you come out from there just to have a PvP?" His tone was very rude and not very pleasant to hear. Her eyes widened slightly. She couldn't believe that he would say such a rude word. Her chin was pinched, and his gaze was burning. "Su Cheng, you think you're doing this for my own good. Just like back then, you turned yourself in and wanted to help everyone. Have you ever thought about me?" His voice became deeper and deeper, until it was almost hoarse. She wanted to retreat, but he held her waist, and she was pinned down again. His fingers pinched her cheeks, and there was an unusual fervor in his eyes as he muttered, "Don't even think about leaving me again." He angrily blocked her lips and kissed her mercilessly, as though he was punishing her. Su Cheng couldn't struggle, and she didn't want to struggle. When his anger subsided and his face was buried in her neck, she caressed the back of his neck with her fingers and comforted him softly. "I won't go." She suddenly hugged his neck tightly and cried, "Kaim, I'm not leaving. I won't leave again unless you kick me out." She hugged him like a child. After such a long separation and so many changes, she would also be afraid if she couldn't see him. "Kaim, I'm scared too. What I'm most afraid of is that you look at me with contempt. What I'm most afraid of is that you don't want me anymore. What I'm most afraid of is that you think it's a disgrace to have such a mother and won't let me see He Huan." However, he still wanted her. He actually wanted her. How happy she was right now. Her eyes were filled with tears and they stained his neck. It was wet and warm, making him feel extremely uncomfortable. He turned her little face and kissed her forcefully. Their long-awaited bodies were once again entangled together. That night, they were each other's consolation as they licked each other's wounds. From night till dawn, they didn't separate at all. However, she only had 2 days. At 2 in the afternoon the next day, Yi Liangqiu came over as well. Kaim drove her to the northern suburbs. When Su Cheng was about to enter, she turned around and looked at Yi Liangqiu. She mouthed something silently. Yi Liangqiu didn't hear it clearly, but she understood what Su Cheng meant. She nodded as her eyes misted up. She thought that compared to Su Cheng, her relationship with Anlin was nothing. Chapter 17:13. Su Cheng stood outside the high wall with tears in her eyes. She looked at Kaim and didn't move for a long time. Kaim closed the car door and walked over slowly. He held her shoulder gently and pulled her into his arms. "Shuheng." She rested her face on his shoulder and said in a low voice, "Don't be too nice to me. I'm afraid I won't be used to it." She still had to go into atone for her sins. It was tough inside, but her heart was calm. It seemed that with every minute of suffering, she was one step closer to him. She took a step back and looked at him with clear reluctance in her eyes. She lowered her head and looked at his neck. When she looked up again, her eyes were resolute. "Take care of our child." She finally dared to say to him, "Wait for me to come back." Kaim stood and didn't say anything. He only squeezed her hand. She was about to leave, but he didn't let go. He said in a hoarse voice, "I'll come and see you." Su Cheng didn't say anything else. She retreated bit by bit, leaving his world and his warmth. She really shouldn't come and see him often. She said softly, "It's okay." She smiled sweetly at him. Kaim watched her leave with tears in his eyes. His mother had left and he had to see her again. If it weren't for Liangqiu, he might not have had the courage to do so. He only turned around when he couldn't see Su Cheng anymore. Yi Liangqiu stood beside the car and looked straight in the direction where Su Cheng had left. When she met Kaim's gaze, she pursed her lips and smiled. "Let's go back." It would take 2 hours to drive back to the city. There was a traffic jam at night and they might not be able to reach there by 8 o'clock. Kaim nodded, but he still turned around to look at the high wall. The woman he loved the most was trapped here. On the way back, Liangqiu was still driving. She was afraid that Kaim wouldn't be able to concentrate, so he was obviously distracted. We still have a chance to see each other in the future, she comforted him softly. In the past, Kaim had helped her a lot. What she was doing now was just scratching the surface. Kaim smiled bitterly and raised his head. Tears welled up in his eyes? He let out a long sigh. It's so bitter inside. How could she get used to it? Yi Liangqiu pursed her lips and replied after a long while, it's impossible for her to get used to it. She's just getting used to it. She paused for a moment. Kaim, she just wants to turn herself into the best Su Cheng, to match you. How could he not know? It was just that the price was a little too high. As the car sped along the highway, Kaim's voice suddenly rang out. He went to France for something more important. It's not what you think. Yi Liangqiu tightened her grip on the steering wheel and smiled nonchalantly. You mean, President Qin and Xia Mian are sharing a room in Paris? She said it casually. Kaim tilted his head and stared at her for a long while before saying, President Qin doesn't have that kind of feelings for her. Really? Yi Liangqiu didn't speak and focused on driving. It wasn't until they reached his apartment that she turned her face and said softly, Kaim, that's not important. What's important is that if the ATV can't be kept, I don't have the right to question who he's with, right? Kaim's face twisted and he sighed. I might have to offend you later. Yi Liangqiu smiled and changed the topic. Go back and have a good rest. Chapter 17-14. Kaim nodded and got out of the car. Yi Liangqiu sat in the car but didn't get out immediately. Instead, she took out a magazine from the cabinet in front of her. She opened it and saw that the first issue was about the scandal between Xia Mian and Qin Anlin. In front of a hotel room in Hong Kong, Xia Mian and Qin Anlin stood side by side. Although they didn't do anything inappropriate, the sight of a man and a woman standing in front of a hotel room at midnight was enough to arouse people's imaginations. Yi Liangqiu stared at it for a long time before putting it down and starting the car. Qin Anlin came back on the 6th day of the new year. Xia Mian accompanied him, but as soon as they got off the plane, they were surrounded by reporters. Qin Anlin didn't take the same passage as Xia Mian. He left through the VIP passage. When Xia Mian was being interviewed by the reporters, her eyes were filled with tears. I think everyone knows that I was cheated by a scumbag. It was President Qin who comforted me and taught me a lot. Comforted? Taught her a lot? The reporters were imagining a drama. Did he comfort Xia Mian in the same room and teach her a lot? The reporters didn't let it go, but Xia Mian didn't say anything. She smiled and quickly left the airport. This kind of report was overwhelming, the 8th day of the new year. In the top-floor office of the ATV, Linda threw a newspaper on the floor and said angrily, Xia Mian is so shameless. She directed and acted on her own. She really didn't understand why Qin Anlin kept Xia Mian's bad hand. She didn't understand, but Yi Liangqiu did. Yi Liangqiu smiled faintly. Because he knows that I care about Xia Mian. If he wants to deal with me, of course he'll pick something that makes me uncomfortable and disturb my mind. Linda's neck shrank. He doesn't care about his reputation? When has President Qin ever cared about his reputation? Yi Liangqiu sighed. Only by letting Xia Mian create a scandal can she maintain a certain level of exposure. Also, Xia Mian probably needs to change her style. Look at her on the cover of the men's clothing issue. It's a big deal. Linda paused. Anyway, I hate this woman. Yi Liangqiu glanced at her. As long as President Qin doesn't hate it. These words are a bit sour. Linda thought immorally in her heart. However, Linda mentioned something else. Mr. Yi, President Su came to me a few days ago. Yi Liangqiu glanced at her. Why? Linda pursed her lips. He asked me about your relationship with President Qin. I'll just tell you the truth. You're my personal secretary. There's nothing you can't say. Yi Liangqiu said indifferently, if I hide everything from you, then there's something wrong. Linda said, oh. Yi Liangqiu closed the document in front of her. King Entertainment is about to announce a full acquisition of ATV. Inform all the departments to be more cautious from today onwards. Especially any contact with King Entertainment, they have to go through me. Linda asked softly, what Mr. Yi means is that we can't let King Entertainment succeed. Of course. Yi Liangqiu stood up slowly. I'm the CEO of ATV. Linda nodded. Although she didn't know, she was on Mr. Ye's side. Whatever Mr. Yi said, she would do. At the beginning of the new year, King Entertainment began to completely ban ATV. Many of the artists who worked with ATV also backed out of their scheduled shows. ATV's purchase of broadcasting rights was also repeatedly blocked, and the resistance came from King Entertainment. Chapter 17-15. Ever since ATV had been acquired by King Entertainment, its shares had plummeted and everyone was in a state of panic. ATV was unprecedentedly tense and uneasy from top to bottom. The senior management who owned shares had begun to contact King Entertainment secretly, intending to sell their shares. They all had their own plans. Although Mr. Yi was capable, King Entertainment had first-hand resources. Many of the film and television productions were produced by King Entertainment. If they were to go head-to-head, Mr. Yi might not be their match. The storm lasted for more than a month. Even Su Shicheng had personally come to the company twice to express his condolences, but Yi Liangqiu had dismissed him on the grounds of fair competition. When Su Shicheng left, although he was unwilling, it wasn't wise to let him drag his injured body to take charge of the overall situation. ATV would only die faster. He was a little annoyed. He had seen ATV prosper before. How could it fail just like that? Su Shicheng left the office. Linda sent him off and came back. Mr. Yi, I secretly overheard Mr. Su talking to a few important shareholders just now. Those few said they wanted to replace Mr. Yi. They all thought that it was because of Mr. Yi that King Entertainment kept their eyes on ATV, Linda said carefully. Yi Liangqiu lowered her eyes. Then go and check the shares of those shareholders. Linda's eyes widened. She looked at Yi Liangqiu in disbelief. Mr. Yi means, I think their shares have already been sold. Yi Liangqiu's tone was very calm. Once you've found out, let Su Shicheng know. It's better for him to clean up the mess himself. Linda nodded. Okay. She went out for half an hour. When she came back, her expression was very ugly. Yi Liangqiu only needed to glance at her to know that she had guessed correctly. Sure enough, those people had sold their shares. They were forcing Su Shicheng to kick her out of the picture. This was probably Qin Anlin's idea. But she didn't understand. Was Qin Anlin unwilling to be her enemy, or was she a difficult opponent for him? She would rather believe the latter. Su Shicheng, on the other hand, was very fast. He quickly cleaned up the traders. Not only that, Linda also explained in detail Su Shicheng's methods. Behind the scenes, those people did not have a good ending. This was his usual style, and Yi Liangqiu was not surprised. Of course, this also shocked the other shareholders who wanted to betray ATV. Those few people were a bloody example. Linda was a little scared. Mr. Yi, the CEO wasn't like this in the past. Yi Liangqiu knew what she was thinking. She smiled faintly and poured a glass of water for Linda. In the future, when Su Shicheng asks you about me, you just tell him. There's nothing he can't know. Linda held the glass of water and looked at Yi Liangqiu for a long time before nodding slightly. I hope you'll be fine. Yi Liangqiu still had a faint smile on her face, but there was a hint of loneliness in her smile. Because there were too many people who had left her side. ATV, under the attack of King Entertainment, was in a precarious situation. And the entertainment industry was a place where people supported the strong and trampled on the weak. If things got worse, it would only get worse. In the end, it was to the point where ATV couldn't even hire celebrities even if they spent money to shoot dramas. As for ATV, once its capital was exhausted, it could close down. You're tuning into the Dreamy Chapters YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.